Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host Sean, joined as always by Johnston for another compelling tale of another fighter from boxing history. And this particular fighter is one that is very famous because of a certain film and not just his boxing career. Many people picked up on Jake La Motta through the film Raging Bull. Now, this was one of the best films ever made. One of the best boxing films ever made, but also one of the best films ever made. Really ahead of its time. And it told the story of Jake La Motta. And what we're here to do in this episode is to also tell you the story, but in more detail, with more information and stuff that you may not have heard that may change your perception of a certain Jake La Motta.
It will. I've battled myself for this one, Sean, to be honest with you. I was a fan of Jake's, or was I? I sort of debated that in my head when we were doing these notes, because I sort of feel maybe I was a fan of Robert De Niro and Catherine Moriarty and Joe Pesci in the film Raging Bull rather than the actual guy, Jake La Motta, because there's some things in this story that quite simply just turn me off. So, yeah, I think other listeners are going to feel the same about this. It's a difficult one. You battle with it throughout. So enjoy it, really, as much as you can, because there are some really disturbing stuff in this whole story. So, yeah, just be aware of that. But it's still very interesting. And as you said, Sean, we don't sort of cut any corners when it comes to these career profiles anymore. So this is a very complete edition of Jake La Motta.
And it all begins when he was born, Giacobbe, aka Jake La Motta. And he was born on July 10th, 1922, although our sources indicated the year as 1921. Jake initially lived in Philadelphia for a few years from birth, but was brought up on the rough streets of the Bronx in New York City on the Lower East Side of Manhattan on 1st Avenue and 10th Street. Both his parents, Elizabeth Maluzzo and Joseph La Motta, were of Italian descent. Jake's mother was Italian, but born in the United States, while his father was from Messina in Italy and moved to America. Joseph never wanted to integrate into American society, so never bothered to become fluent in English, resulting in a lack of job opportunities. Therefore, he worked as a salesman out of a horse and wagon, which didn't bring in much money, so the family were always living on the poverty line. In extra need of money, and because his father was just plain nasty, he made Jake fight for pennies and nickels, starting when he was 8 years old. Once a week, his father would force him to fight in social clubs. Sometimes he fought as many as 3 times a week. Disgustingly, child fights for change were actually a common theme, and Jake's father saw his son as a meal ticket. As time went on, he sometimes managed to pick up a book for himself, but most of the time his winnings would go on the rent or pay for food, which annoyed him, and Jake recalled, "Then when we got home, he'd take the money off me that I won. Great guy, my old man." Jake, his sisters Anna and Marie, and his baby brother Albie lived in the family home. However, his other brother Joey didn't. He was mainly raised by his grandparents.
Yeah, Joseph La Motta was a nasty piece of work, and he didn't think twice about raising his fists or using anything else that he had at hand on his wife or his children, especially Jake. Now, if Jake never made it home from church on time, then he would feel the wrath of his father. He recalled, "My father was a really mean son of a bitch. If I wasn't home before those church bells rang, he'll drag me upstairs and tie me to the foot of the bed and beat me with that broomstick he had nailed 9 leather strips to, till my back bled." So his mother screamed and tried to get his father to stop beating him, but her endeavours were left in vain. Only when she actually faked a fainting spell did the beating cease. Jake also witnessed his father's domestic abuse of his mother too, and when he pleaded for him to stop, his father was oblivious to his pleas. This went on until Jake was around 12. By then, he was already big enough to grab his dad and make him stop. Thought about hitting his dad, but he held back. Joseph La Motta would actually end up in the slammer for a while for violating child welfare rules, which must have been a much-needed respite for the family. Author Lou Friedman, who wrote the book Fighting for Life, the story of Jake La Motta, wrote, "Once, La Motta said his actual holiday present was a single lump of coal in the Christmas stocking, illustrating the bleakness of his existence as a youth. Later, LaMotta joked that on Christmas his father went outdoors, shot off a gun, and returned saying Santa Claus committed suicide. Once Jake was actually beat up on the street. Now he managed to scramble to his feet and leg it home, hoping to seek refuge and comfort from his father, but it never came.
When he returned home and told his father about what had happened, he became angry with him for running, so he handed him an ice pick and told him to use it if anyone else tried to mug him or fight him. From that moment on, Jake became known as someone not to mess with. Then one day, he left the ice pick at home. Ironically, that was the day that someone gave him some trouble. So his only alternative was to fight with his fists. Jake battered the boy senseless with his bare hands and loved every minute of it, setting the tone for plenty more street fights. Years later, he said he got into so many street fights he lost count, but if someone challenged him, he always fought. Not only was his neighbourhood rough, but the whole of America was in a terrible state when the Great Depression hit in 1929, and sure enough, Jake and his family were struggling to afford the most important thing of all, food. When Thanksgiving arrived, the family had no food, so Jake took it upon himself to intervene. He took to the streets, stole a turkey, and told his unconvinced mother that he won it in a raffle, and Jake said, "Being on home relief doesn't do much to keep you warm. Everything piles up on you when you're poor. The super in the building doesn't give a damn, and God knows the landlord doesn't. So winters, I remember wearing as many clothes as I could, and staying in bed as much as I could, or in the kitchen, which was about the only room in the house that was even halfway warm." It wasn't just a lack of food and warmth that young Jake had to contend with. He said that rats lived in the walls too, rattling around and squealing.
Now, although Prohibition had ended by the time Jake was 12 years old, his neighbourhood was still full of ex-bootleggers and gangs from all nationalities. The Irish, Italian, Jewish and Polish had all once smuggled in most of the illegal whiskey, leaving the oldest section of the borough poverty-stricken. To survive in such a hostile environment, he had to be streetwise, and you had to be tough. Otherwise, whatever you possessed would be taken from you, and learnt very quickly that he needed to be able to handle himself. So he became known in the neighbourhood as a tough guy. By 16, he dropped out of school and became a petty criminal, initially stealing hubcaps, copper wiring, typewriters and even a violin, but then he moved on to street muggings. He would follow his unsuspecting victims down alleyways and hit them over the head with a lead pipe. If the police caught up with Jake, he wasn't fazed. He once threw a hatchet at a policeman when he was caught burgling a house. When he wrote his autobiography, he said his activities would more likely have been labelled him a juvenile delinquent. But there was one crime that Jake could never shake from his memory. In fact, he was forever haunted and haunted him for the decade or for the next decade. And that it was the fact that he had indeed killed a man. Now, to explain this story, again, author Lou Friedman explains it all. So, he wrote, sneaking up on a neighbourhood bookie named Harry Gordon, who had never done him any harm. La Motta, shaking with fear due to the irrational act he was about to commit, jumped the man in the darkness. Nervous, Jake La Motta worked himself into a frenzied state to commit his crime. The goal was to swipe Gordon's wallet and take the cash to help his family.
Lou Friedman continued with the description and said, La Motta bashed Gordon on the head with a club, and when the man did not go easily into that good night, he pummeled him with his fists and left him for dead. He took the wallet and ran like hell. Sure, he was going to be discovered and arrested. As his adrenaline subsided, La Motta felt fear, not relief. Although no sirens could be heard tailing him, he raced to a local social club and confided in his best friend Pete Savage, where they were stunned to learn the wallet had no money in it. Still, La Motta felt certain someone spotted him and would identify him and that he'd be busted. Yet no cops came around asking questions. Soon after, a small item about the mugging appeared in the newspaper stating Gordon had died. The article noted the assailant had missed Gordon's stash of $1,700 he was hiding on his person. Everything about this act was futile. LaMotta was angry, somewhat ashamed, and felt stupid for overlooking the money. It didn't help matters that his friend Pete Savage taunted him for that mistake. Jake was on a path to disaster, and soon he was handed a gun by his mate Pete, and they decided to rob a bunch of wise guys during a card game. Jake felt tougher with a weapon, and he said, "That's what it's about, a gun. With a gun, you're the man." They were initially refused entry to the card game and thought of ditching the plan, but then, as Lou Friedman explains, they managed to gain entry. And he wrote, "When he and Savage burst into the card room, LaMotta, sweating so much, said he worried he might not even be able to keep hold of the gun. He took command. He waved around 2 pistols like some old Western gunfighter."
And Lou Freeman continues, he said that he, as in Jake La Motta, was a bossy thief, arrogant, ordering the players around. Even as Savage trembled, worrying what his pal might do. Unknown to La Motta, a couple of mob members were at the table witnessing this wild man act. They legged it to their local social club, but soon police arrived to arrest Jake and Pete. Ironically, it wasn't for the card game robbery, nor the attack on Gordon, but for a jewellery store that he robbed that had gone wrong. Now, when Jake broke into the store, he was startled by the alarm and ran, but he was identified at the scene by pedestrians who picked him out of a lineup. Savage was freed, but Jake pleaded guilty to the break-in, thinking he would be given a lesser sentence because it was his first offence on record. However, he was already a known thug to the police, and they had been watching him. So when he was incarcerated to a so-called reform school currently named Coxsackie Correctional Facility, he was sentenced to 1 to 3 years. Now, from the moment he arrived and met the warden, he was identified as a troublemaker, a 16-year-old kid that needed to be taken down a peg or 3. The guards would push and shove him around because they could and because the warden told them to. He was forced to work outside with ditch digging crew. He planned his escape on the first night he was there. He was never going to escape this place. The only way he could leave was to toe the line and conform like everybody else, or his sentence would be extended even further. He became a loner, still with the thoughts of escaping, and didn't want to make any friends. That was until he bumped into an old face that he used to run with, and that was Rocky Graziano, aka Rocco.
Graziano warned Jake that misbehaving inside would have consequences. His own sentence had been extended because he knocked out one of the guards. Check out our Legendary Nights episode, The Tale of Graziano vs. Zale, for more details on that story. And we also tried to convince Jake that he was mad to try and escape. He had done a similar thing in a minor detention centre and ended up in this place, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. So Graziano, he offered to help his friend, even though he knew it was a bad idea. The plan was for Jake to sneak into the back of a furniture truck at the chapel as Rocky distracted the driver. However, the driver spotted Jake hiding through one of his mirrors and he delivered him directly into the hands of the guards. Jake did not even get beyond the prison walls. He said that the guards smacked him around a little as they brought him to his new resting place, the hole. Once he returned to his cell, one of the other inmates suggested that they would turn him in to their girlfriend, but Jake didn't hold back and he punched the guy through the bars of his cell, but was overpowered by the guards and they gave him another kicking. The way Jake was going, he would be in this place for a long time, but then the prison priest, Father Joseph, took a shine to him. At first, he was told under no uncertain terms to fuck off, but the priest was persistent until he finally broke down some barriers. Jake was able to speak up about his troubled childhood and his anxiety, that the only things he knows is to steal and is to fight. The fighting talk he could help him with, so he enlisted Jake into the prison boxing program.
When he showed up at the gym, he was being his usual pig-headed self and thought he could beat up anyone who was presented to him. Rocky advised Jake to listen and learn before jumping in the ring with just anyone. But his mate insisted, so he picked out the biggest guy in the gym and forced the guy to fight by insulting him. Even before they began, Rocky advised that he stay away from the big guy, but he just wouldn't listen. Jake went straight at his opponent, thinking he could smash him up like he had done all the other guys on the street many, many times. But this was boxing. It's completely different to the streets. And as Rocky predicted, Jake was taught a very harsh lesson when the more experienced opponent began to sidestep and land repeatedly on his face. He soon fatigued while punches rained in on his face until he was battered, bruised and bloodied. As Rocky removed Jake's gloves, LaMotta promised that he would gain revenge before he was released. That beating actually inspired Jake to apply himself, to listen to instructions, to soak up as much knowledge as he could. After some months of training, he was notified that he would be released. So a return bout was actually arranged with the prison champion, who outweighed Jake by some 15 pounds. This time, the fight ended with LaMotta's hand being raised as he dominated the prison champ from the first bell to the last. As Jake left behind the correctional facility, he emerged into the outside world with the skills to be a boxer and could finally see a future past crime. He told Father Joseph, "I'm serious about fighting. I'm going to be a fighter. I always wanted to be one, and now I'll find out I can be one."
Not only had Jake acquired the necessary skills to begin a career in professional boxing, but the sport had also taught him how to be more cool and level-headed, if that was ever possible for someone as hot-headed as LaMotta. But he now had something to aim for, and as fighting came natural to him anyway, he now had the bit between his teeth and was more reluctant to get involved in crime. When he bumped into his old mate, Pete Savage, he told him, "A guy like me, the only thing I can do for money is either steal or fight. You know what my record is in the stealing department." There were many gyms to choose from in New York during the 30s and 40s, so he picked one where he could improve his boxing skills, but there was always a mob figure wherever he trained. Jake was once quoted as saying, "I also noticed that around the gym all the time, there were the mob guys, for the very simple reason that they're always betting on fights. And betting means money, and wherever there's money, there's the mob. If you paste that inside your hat, it will explain a lot of things to you, and maybe even save you some trouble." Even this early into his boxing career, before he had even thrown a punch as an amateur or professional, Jake was approached by the mob and told how they could manage him to the top. But he understood what that involved. Yes, of course, Jake was cut from the same cloth as many of these underworld figures, but when it came to fighting in the ring, he felt a sense of pride, so no law of money was ever going to force him to take a dive. Well, at least not yet anyway.
Yes, Jake had a couple of options. He either fights as an amateur with the Olympics, the national and or the state Golden Gloves championships being his aim, or turn professional. He decided to fight in a major amateur competition for the diamond belt, which he won. But the lack of money was always a problem. He wanted to get paid for taking whacks to the head. And let's face it, if anyone's seen Jake's style, it's not suited for the amateurs. So he turned over to the professional ranks. He initially signed with a manager who was taking a large chunk of his purse. So he had to sue the guy to get out of that contract. Now, due to the lack of funds a fighter gets early in their careers and the split of that purse with the manager and the trainer, well, Jake decided to go at it alone, with his brother sort of as his manager. His logic was that if he didn't have to split his purse of about $100 at the time for a fight with anyone, then he was making more money for himself. So turning professional at a time when the mob were at the most dominant would hinder Jake's progress throughout his career because of his refusal to play ball with the men who ran boxing for a generation. Those guys were initially the underworld figures within the local Bronx region, but would gradually become the bigwigs within the industry, such as the old Madison Square Garden promoter, Uncle Mike Jacobs, mafia members Frank Costello, Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo, along with their more presentable business associates in Jim Norris and Truman Gibson of the IBC, plus a large list of unknown connections to the mafia. Jake La Motta eventually made his professional debut on March 3rd, 1941, at the St. Nicholas Rink in New York against a guy called Charlie Mackley, taking a 4-round points decision.
Although Jake is known as a middleweight, and it was the 160-pound division where he gained his fame, from the beginning of his boxing career, he fought anywhere between 155 and 175 pounds. Most of his fights in the early years were fought at whatever weight he felt comfortable with at the time. It was well known that in between fights he would balloon up in weight because he loved his food. He never worried about cutting weight until a fight was agreed. This was never a problem for Jake early in his career because there was always flexibility when agreeing to a weight class. However, when he fought for the title later in his career, this would inevitably cause him problems. Jake fought 20 times in 1941 in his first year as a pro, all over the East Coast from Brooklyn to the Bronx, in Queens, Long Island, Cleveland, New York City and Chicago. He established his most famous nickname, the Bronx Bull. The Bronx, because that was where he was from, and Bull, because that's how he fought, charging straight ahead. It was only later, long after retirement, people called him Raging Bull. His style was a real crowd pleaser, but he lacked that knockout blow, which he put down to him having small hands. But maybe it was because he fought bigger men, or maybe it was due to him targeting the body more than the head. His style was to wear down opponents rather than landing concussive blows to the head. Either way, his first year was successful, and that included 3 defeats and a draw. But that didn't discourage the unwanted attention he was receiving from gangsters. They would always be around to linger in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jake would not succumb to their demands for quite some time.
Jake was described by author Kevin Mitchell as a crude, tough kid who raged through his era with manic energy, hounded by the mob, and very occasionally his conscience. In his first year as a pro, 2 of his 3 defeats came against a light heavyweight, Jimmy Reeves. The first was a split decision defeat in his initial 10-rounder, his very first 10-rounder on September the 24th, 1941 in Cleveland, Ohio. The Associated Press actually wrote for 7 rounds, Reeves pounded La Motta from pillar to post. The situation changed dramatically in the last 3 rounds. In round 9, Reeves went through the ropes for a 9 count. In the 10th, he was down 4 times, twice from exhaustion and twice from La Motta's punches. As seen in the opening scenes of the film Raging Bull, a riot broke out near the ring and the crowd booed for near on 20 minutes after Cleveland's Jimmy Reeves received an unpopular decision. The organist actually played the Star-Spangled Banner to help calm the disturbance, but it didn't work. Afterwards, the referee said that the way I looked at it, Reeves had piled up such a big margin, he seemed entitled to finish if he could. He was more tired than hurt. Reeves was on the floor when that final bell sounded. Well, 1 month later, they met again, and Jake admitted to freezing during the bout, saying, "I was scared." When he snapped out of it, he was once again way behind on points. He came on strong in the last 2 rounds, but lost a unanimous decision. Jake's third loss came against a guy called Nate Bowden, who also defeated a certain Tony Zhao. He beat him twice. And this was Jake's sternest test so far. And this was to end 1941. Now, Jake actually reflected afterwards, what a pounding. If he had been stronger, he'd have flattened me. He wanted absolutely nothing but points. Bowden had no intention of mixing it up at all.
And he continued to say, what he intended to do, and he did do, was let me charge, let me swing, and all he did was jab, dance, counterpunch, duck, and hit. He hit me so much, I was as much a mess as I've ever been. He lost by majority decision in Chicago, but that defeat taught Jake another lesson. just like when he fought the prison champion, and it would put him in good stead for the future. Jake's record now stood at 16 wins, 3 by way of knockout, 3 defeats and 1 draw against Joe Giacobbe. 2 weeks before the loss to Bolden, there was a surprise military strike by the Japanese upon the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. Jake was ready to accept the call-up for war and fight for his country, but he was USDA rejected as 4F, meaning unfit for service, by his local draft board. The reason was a mastoid operation he had performed on one of his ears. The purpose of such surgery was to remove infected cells within the mastoid bone caused by ear infections or ear diseases, the air cells forming a hollow space in the skull. He probably should have been declared unfit to box if he was unfit for war, but logic in boxing is not something that is blessed with, so Jake continued to fight in the ring. Outside the ring, and Jake had another traumatic moment in his life. While he was driving with his father, they hit a boy who had darted into the road in front of the car. In a panic, they scooped up the injured boy and rushed him to hospital, where they tried to save his life, but sadly he died. LaMotta gave his entire earnings from his next fight to the boy's family as a gesture of atonement. Despite that, Vicky La Motta, his future wife, said Jake was always haunted by this boy's death.
In 1942, Jake was as active as ever, fighting 14 times. In his first 11 from January 27 to September 8, he won 9. Only one was actually a knockout. He just didn't knock people out. He actually lost one and he drew one as well. The draw and the loss came against a tough Puerto Rican, Jose Basora. But the pick of the bunch was a fight with Jimmy Edgar, in what the press called a sensational fight, apparently. In Jake's 12th fight of the year, he faced his sternest test yet, against a man that had pretty much cleaned up the welterweight division, and his name was Sugar Ray Robinson, 35-0. LaMotta seemed like an intriguing matchup for Robinson because he was a bigger man than the other potential opponents that he could have fought, and it gave him a chance to test himself against a legitimate middleweight. As we have already stated a few times, Jake had refused to work with the mob, but interestingly, it was this first fight with Ray Robinson that a certain Frankie Carbo says to fix this fight. Now, it has been suggested that Jake was not approached, but Ray Robinson was. He apparently received a call from somebody who called himself Frankie Carbo, which is hard to believe because that was not necessarily how he did his business, but it could have been one of his associates and said they were Frankie. But either way, he asked something along the lines of, Ray, it's Mr. Gray, associate of the Bull, which he wasn't. We know that just wasn't true. How about when you first fight the Bull, you win, but lose the second? Then the third can be anyone's. Ray wasn't interested, so he politely declined the offer, saying he doesn't do business that way. Considering that Jake La Motta and Sugar Ray Robinson were both able to generate a lot of interests in their fights, and with it a lot of money, it is very possible that Robinson was approached without Jake's knowledge, and it is also very possible that Ray would have turned it down.
La Motta and Robinson were probably the only two fighters that could turn away such dangerous individuals without any repercussions. Either way, we'll never really know, but what we do know is that this first meeting between La Motta and Robinson would be the start of one of the most famous and fiercest rivalries in boxing history. Please do listen to our Legendary Nights episode if you haven't. Robinson explained his philosophy on boxing after his pro debut in 1940, and it didn't really change much throughout his career when he said, "Rhythm is everything in boxing. Every move you make starts with your heart, and that's in rhythm, or you're in trouble. Your rhythm should set the pace of the fight. You make him fight your fight, and that's what boxing's all about." Jake weighed in at 157 pounds for the bout, while Robinson was 145, which meant a 12-pound weight advantage for Jake, but it didn't make any difference. On October 2nd, 1942, at Madison Square Garden, in front of a crowd of just under 13,000, Ray's quick hands and excellent footwork was too much for La Motta, who put on a brave show. But it was not one-sided, and he lost by unanimous decision. Robinson was able to hit him at will, but he could not put the iron-chin La Motta down to the canvas at any point. Jake simply said, "Robinson outpointed me over 10 rounds in the first fight, so I was down one." Before the rematch, Jake La Motta kept himself active, winning a unanimous decision against Henry Chmielewski at the Mechanics Building in Boston. Next, it was Jimmy Edgar in a rematch at the Olympia in Detroit on New Year's Day of 1943. The smaller Edgar proved just as difficult to get past in the return as he had been in their August 1942 fight, but Jake prevailed with a split decision victory.
And 2 weeks later, Jake then appeared at the Detroit venue again, home to the ice hockey team, the Red Wings, and recorded a rare 6th round technical knockout against Charlie Hayes. The win over Hayes, who was a very solid fighter and who had never been knocked down, was his most notable win since the Robinson defeat. However, all this was just a prelude to another shot at Ray Robinson. During 1942, middleweight champion Tony Zhao, welterweight champion Freddie Cochran, and other champions, or world champions, as in heavyweight champion Joe Louis and Gus Lesnovich, who was the light heavyweight champion, they were all unable to defend their crowns while on war duty, as the Army and the Navy would not permit them to box. Therefore, Jake La Motta and Sugar Ray Robinson would have to contend with fighting for a ranking spot rather than a title. However, Ray wanted the 147-pound title, which he would finally capture in 4 years' time, and Jake was chasing that 160-pound crown. But he would have to wait much longer and jump through way more hoops than Ray did, believe it or not. So the rematch against Sugar Ray Robinson, now 40-0, came just 4 months after the first meeting at the Olympia Stadium in Detroit on February the 5th, 1943. Just under 19,000 came to witness a significant moment in boxing history, and that was the day that Sugar Ray Robinson finally lost his first professional fight. In a moment of reflection, Robinson recalled feeling uneasy in the ring just before the start of the bout, when the contestants were introduced. During the introductions, Robinson admitted, "Suddenly, for the first time in my boxing career, I was unsure of myself. That moment when you're being introduced, man, that's a boxer's moment of truth. You're all by yourself then. It's too late for anyone to help you. And what's worse, it's too late for you to help yourself." That's what worried me. La Motta fought with fury, cutting off the ring, forcing his way on the inside, landing right hands to the body and left hooks upstairs. He was fighting like a raging bull in there.
A pivotal moment occurred in the 8th round of a scheduled 10-rounder when La Motta unloaded on Robinson and punched him through the ropes. A lesser man would have called it quits then, but Robinson lifted himself back through the ropes and back into contention. Still, it was a signature moment for La Motta, who went on to take a unanimous decision. It remains a famous result, Jake La Motta ending Sugar Ray Robinson's winning streak, and the Bull said, "I would have to say that Robinson was the best I fought. A cutie, fast, with all the tricks, but he could also take a punch, and he could also throw one." Robinson respected Jake's win, but he blamed himself for losing when he said, "When I walked out of the bell, Jake stomped me with his first left hook, and he stomped me for 10 rounds. Robinson summed up the 8th round knockdown by saying, "He hit me with a right hand in my midsection, and when I doubled up, he let go a left to my jaw. For the first time in my career, I had no legs. I sagged through the ropes and onto the ring apron and sprawled there." Robinson had learned his lesson. He recalled the fans booing as he sat on his stool in his corner and made a promise to himself. "I made a vow never to get into a ring unless I was in perfect condition, unless I could face my moment of truth." Much later in life, Robinson confessed that he had spent much of his prep time for the La Motta rematch pursuing women and staying out late and partying. At one point he wrote, "You left all your strength with those girls you were chasing." With those thoughts running through his head, Robinson was eager to get the third fight with La Motta quickly because he was aware of his impending draft call for World War II.
Robinson knew that money would soon dry up while not fighting. In fact, Ray was actually scheduled to be drafted the day after the bout. Because both fighters had excellent followings in Detroit, their third fight was again scheduled at the same venue, the Olympia Stadium. Jake wasn't best pleased with how Robinson was actually being portrayed in the papers before their fight. He said, "I'm not knocking him on it. I would have done the same thing in his shoes." But he got every newspaper inch there was about the story of his brave boy off to fight for his country. Robinson was eager to get back to winning ways as quickly as possible, and he admitted, "My pride had probed me into training hard this time round." It was a quick turnover. Just 3 weeks had passed until they entered the ring to square off a third time on February the 26th, 1943. There was significant variation in weight once again. La Motta weighed in over 160 pounds and Robinson 145. According to the Associated Press, Robinson was on a one-man riot in the early rounds. He had La Motta in trouble in the 4th round as he scored with both hands. However, in the 7th round, La Motta trapped Robinson in his own corner and delivered a hard left hand to his head that dropped Sugar Ray Robinson to the canvas. Robinson took an 8 count, but he demonstrated those amazing recovery skills, coming out for the 8th round like nothing had happened. The fight went the 10th round distance, and to the scorecards, where referee Sam Hennessy gave 5 rounds to Robinson, 3 to La Motta and 2 even. The 2 judges also gave it to Robinson, although the fans did not agree. They booed the result, swayed by Jake La Motta's knockdown of Sugar Ray Robinson. La Motta felt aggrieved. He thought he had done enough to capture the decision, pointing directly to that knockdown.
The trouble was that he would only have won in 1 round on a round scoring system. It was not the 10-point mush system that we use today, which would have given him a 10-8 round. Not that it would have mattered, because the judges Joe Lenahan and Frank Fisher gave La Motta no more than 2 rounds of the 10. Jake said, "I didn't lose it. He got the decision." That's when I began to think of Robinson as a nemesis. They wouldn't meet again for another 2 years. By 1943, Jake had built a major fan following and should have been in clear contention for a world title shot even after defeat to Ray Robinson. But he wasn't. He was never going to get the big prize without cooperating with the mobsters that ran boxing. Now, with Robinson being drafted into World War II and with the current champions having their titles frozen, the pool of fighters to compete against had shrunk even further. He was still loved by the fans and the boxing experts, but despised by the gangsters for his reluctance to work with them. Only weeks after Robinson became an enlisted man, La Motta returned to the ring to face Jimmy Reeves again in Detroit. Jake finally got the better of his man, putting him down in the 6th round before knocking him out in the same round. He remarked that even with a limited pot of fighters, that he was paid $6,000 for the night's work, and said, "Which is $1,000 a round. I was fighting good." He bragged that, "I made more than $1 million in purses throughout my career, and you don't win that by fighting your Aunt Sadie." A couple of fights later in May, Jake La Motta began a new rivalry with Fritzy Zivic. La Motta and Zivic went after each other for the first time on June 10, 1943 in Forbes Field, home of the Pittsburgh Pirates and essentially Zivic's home patch.
Some suggest the fight was close and as good as many expected between 2 rough and tough scrappers. Everyone expected these two to create a great fight, and they did. But other reports actually disagreed with that. The result of their first duel was actually a split decision victory for La Motta, which was booed by the pro-Zivic crowd. Now, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Press both felt that Zivic won by a considerable margin. The latter paper stated that La Motta received the boxing lesson of his life. Both would have been hugely favourable to Zivic, so it's hard to gauge, but the following day Zivic did request to the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission that they sponsor a rematch, this time over a 15-round distance. So, 1 month later, on July the 12th, 1943, They fought again, back at the Forbes field, and this time Zivic walked away with the split decision victory. The New York Times reported on the fight and said La Motta, a human windmill, could not get started as Zivic kept him continuously off balance through the early rounds with a left jab. Zivic was the boxing master through the first 9 rounds, and only in the 2nd and 7th round did La Motta gain an edge. After the 9th, the veteran couldn't hold the heavier puncher, but it was apparently a fast rally in the final round that gave him the decision. This time, Jake felt hard done by, and he quoted a headline in a local newspaper commenting on the result, and it read, "La Motta wins, Zivic gets nod." Before they met again, Jake fought Jose Basora for a 3rd time, after losing one and drawing the other. La Motta eventually knocked the Puerto Rican down 4 times in the 1st round, and once in the 2nd round on September the 17th, 1943 in Detroit. Although it looked like La Motta was about to stop Basora, he was unable to find that knockout blow. But he did eventually beat him, and he took a UD over 10 rounds.
One more victory followed before Jake was ready for a 3rd fight with Zivic. He was then currently the #1 contender for the middleweight title, but had nothing to lose. The mob were never going to offer him a title shot, while he continued to ignore their approaches. Jake said himself, the months passed, and even the years, and still no world title opportunity. The only fight that made sense financially was a 3rd fight with Fritzy Zivic, and they both knew that if they met again they would sell out any arena and pick up a big payday. The La Motta Zivic bout took place on November 12, 1943. This time, the encounter shifted to Jake's home turf and at the Mecca of boxing, Madison Square Garden. The United Press reported on the fight. Ancient Fritzy Zivic may be rematched today with Jake La Motta, who won an unpopular split decision in their 10-round rubber match at MSG. Promoter Mike Jacobs would like to toss them into the Garden ring again on December 17th to satisfy the fans who witnessed last night's brawl and who voiced their disapproval of the verdict with lusty booing. Zivic had complete command in the first half of the fight, giving La Motta a boxing lesson in most of the first 5 heats. But Zivic, tired in the later going, and his younger, heavier opponent came on with a persistent body attack to win 4 of the last 5 sessions. There were no knockdowns, but Fritzy staggered La Motta with a straight right to the chin in the 3rd. Jake had Fritzy on wobbly pins in the 7th after landing a hard left hook to the body and a right to the face. La Motta suffered a gashed left brow in the 3rd round, and Zivic had an old cut reopened under his left eye in the 7th.
But he got the win, and Jake went on to fight 13 times in 1943, and he believes that he made 6 figures. He said, "That was the year, 1943, that I earned over $100,000, which is not bad for a 9th grade dropout from the Bronx slums." He signed to meet Zivic for a 4th time, but not in December as anticipated. It was agreed to take place on January the 14th, 1944 at the Olympia Stadium in Detroit, where La Motta had just a massive following at this point in Detroit, especially. Loads of fans come out to see him at that point. And the United Press wrote again on their 4th bout. And it said Zivic damaged his left hand in the 1st round, but declined to use it as an excuse for his defeat. It was reported as an exciting fight with lots of action. There were no knockdowns, but both fights were shaken up several times. La Motta's best rounds were the 6th and the 10th. Jake said this of his rival, Fritzy Zivic. He said, "He's one of the roughest little customers that ever put on gloves." That was the end of their rivalry. So 2 weeks after La Motta took their series of fights to 3-1, he was back in the ring, outpointed a solid Aussie Harris in their rematch by a split decision. He won their 3rd encounter a month later by the same margin. Both fights were actually hosted in Detroit. Not one to waste time, Jake picked up a UD and a split D against Coley Welch and Lou Woods respectively, both in the same month, March 1944. 2 fights in 1 month. Now considered the duration middleweight champion at this point, Jake was hoping that he could build up such a strong enough record, which now stood at 43-7-2, all the sports writers would rally to his cause. He hoped they would write about his performances and talk about how he deserved a chance to fight for the middleweight crown, still held by Tony Zell, but a year away from being honourably discharged. Jake hoped the pressure would build and Zell would succumb to the noise from outside and make LaMotta his first defence, but that was nothing more than a pipe dream.
At this point, America was put on alert about another talented middleweight who was currently serving his own country, Frenchman Marcel Cerdan. He had made quite an impression in the Allied North African Boxing Championships and was being tipped as a genuine threat to Zell's title when the war ended. The other was Rocky Graziano, who was also making quite a name for himself in the New York arena. Then, of course, as we mentioned in a previous career profile, Charlie Burley was the coloured welterweight champion and held the California State middleweight title. But as we know, he was never considered, especially after he gave Archie Moore a beating in April of 1944. Holman Williams was actually ranked below LaMotta and above Burley in 1944 and would be another black fighter that would not get a world title shot. While on this topic of two Murderers Row members, Jake took on his first member, the excellent Lloyd Marshall, on April 21st, 1944 in Cleveland. On a winning streak of 8, LaMotta went into the fight with confidence, but he came up against one of the best boxers in the business. Although Marshall had been campaigning as a light heavyweight, he agreed to a contracted weight of no more than 161 pounds for the fight. Marshall's manager, Johnny Rogers, even put up a $5,000 guarantee to Marshall's weight. He came in just over 160 pounds and LaMotta was just over 158. Despite the enthusiasm the audience showed for LaMotta's last round rally, which the paper scored for Marshall regardless, it was an admittedly just decision to Marshall, who won 7 of the 10 rounds. LaMotta was rocked on several occasions. Marshall was never bothered, but fatigued in the very last seconds. LaMotta was cut and blooded. Marshall came out of it without a mark. Not once was LaMotta the boss. The stylish Marshall was always in command.
After sustaining a beating, Jake had to take some time away from the ring to heal his cheekbone and his split nostril. Marshall busted him up badly. He returned 5 months later to outpoint George coaching, and 2 months later he stopped coaching in the 9th. On November the 3rd, 1944, once again in Detroit, to end another eventful year. Now, after suffering a bout of amnesia, Sugar Ray Robinson was given an honourable discharge in June and was back fighting, clocking up 6 straight victories. The next logical fight for LaMotta was to meet Sugar Ray Robinson, now 53-1, a 4th bout, which had come almost exactly 2 years since their last. They signed to meet on February the 23rd, 1945 at Madison Square Garden in front of over 18,000 spectators. In the 3 fights before, Robinson fought predominantly on the back foot, using his ridiculously fast hands and blistering footwork. LaMotta, on the other hand, was the aggressor who wanted to cut off the ring and work the body in an attempt to slow Robinson down. But in their 4th fight, Sugar Ray surprised LaMotta by being the aggressor and taking the fight to him from the start. Robinson cut LaMotta on the forehead in the 1st round, and in the 3rd, a left cut the Bronx Bull's lip. Some felt LaMotta was beaten, almost out on his feet, but in the 6th round he came back and was more combative, targeting Robinson with numerous good shots. The Associated Press actually reported that in the 6th round, LaMotta backed Robinson into the corner and rocked him with left and rights to the head. It seemed as if Jake LaMotta might finally be able to knock Robinson out in that round, but it was the only round he caused him any problems. Robinson was back behind his jab, countered with uppercuts, and then directed the fight away from the ropes and back into the centre of the ring, where he pounded away at Jake LaMotta until the final bell.
The decision was a dominant victory for Robinson, but the crowd loved it. In fact, they couldn't get enough of these two and wanted a 5th bout. Knowing the money was there, they agreed to go at it again 7 months later. But before we continue with LaMotta's career and onto a fifth Robinson fight, we're going to move away from the ring to when Jake met 16-year-old Vicky. At the time, he was still married to a Bronx woman named Ida, who was 19 when they wed, and Jake was 20 back in 1941. They had a daughter together called Jacqueline, but their relationship didn't last. Jake was quite simply a woman beater. There is no other way to put it, and he admitted this openly in his autobiography Raging Bull, and he also admitted to much more, which we will go into shortly. At his own party one night, he got so drunk that he knocked himself out. When he awoke, only a few people remained in his apartment, but Ida was lying unconscious on the floor. Disturbingly, Joey informed his brother that he had knocked her out because he thought she was flirting with another woman. He then explained that he had attempted to wake her up from her unconscious state, but had failed and thought she was dead. Honestly believing that Ida was dead, Jake called his friend Pete Savage and asked him for advice. While they waited for Pete to arrive, Joey suggested disposing of the body in the river, and Jake gave it serious thought. He even reflected years later. Right now, it sounds like I was a maniac to be even thinking of throwing a woman into the river. But maybe I was a maniac back then. However, when Pete arrived, he suggested they call a doctor to check her over first, and thankfully she was alive, just severely concussed, and probably still drunk.
Jake's excuse for his behaviour was that they were too young and immature. He said, to be honest about it, the thing that got us together was playing sex. She had a great body, and I was crazy for her. Jake concluded it was a marriage that was headed for divorce from the start. The kind of dame who would marry a guy like me was slated to end up divorced. In the book Raging Bull, LaMotta summarised all 7 of his marriages that he would go on to have by saying, "My basic trouble was that I got married more than I should. Not that I'm saying anything against any of my wives. Why the hell should I? After all, St. Peter ain't even going to give me his personal regards. I'm no bargain." Jake admitted to beating all of the women that he married. He also admitted to something else that author Lou Friedman explained. Now, in an absolute distressing moment, we will explain this through an extract from his book. So, in between clobbering Ida and divorcing her and starting to date Vicky, although the exact timing was not specified by LaMotta in his book, Jake was guilty of egregious and monstrous behaviour with a female acquaintance from the neighbourhood who was a good friend of his pal Pete. Now, Pete had been sent to prison for some of his misdemeanours, and Jake said he would watch out for her. Now, this woman, Viola, told Jake that Pete asked her to ask Jake to write him in prison, and LaMotta told her he was incapable of writing a letter and said he had never written one in his life. However, he could dictate his thoughts to her. He told her that he would come over to her house in 20 minutes for the task, figuring he would produce a few sentences. Now, Viola was younger than Pete and Jake, but had grown up at this point.
Continuing on Lou Friedman, he wrote, "She had a date that night, and when LaMotta arrived at her home for the letter writing assignment, she was dressed up. Jake, who had previously dismissed her as a kid, now thought she looked very sexy. Viola had never liked LaMotta, and at times essentially told him she thought he was a creep. LaMotta had never thought much of her either, but suddenly he was aroused by her appearance. Very quickly, things escalated. LaMotta admitted he grabbed her, kissed her, and even as she cried and fought him, he raped her. All the while, he was telling her that he and Pete were best friends and shared girls. Only it turned out, Viola was not that kind of girl at all. He told her he didn't believe her when she told him she was a virgin, but only realised it too late. LaMotta was fortunate he didn't go to prison, but there was no case made against him. Now, after hearing that, we hope it hasn't put you off wanting to listen to the rest of Jake LaMotta's career profile, because it certainly was a shocking revelation to us. But we must continue. So Jake met Vicky in 1945, and she became pregnant before Jake divorced Ida. She contemplated an abortion but decided against it for religious beliefs. When she told Jake that they were having a boy, he was excited, so he sped up his divorce with Ida, which was completed in Mexico. In the early days, Jake could be a good husband, but that soon changed as time went by. He spoke openly when trying to explain his violent behaviour by saying, "If you had a girl and she was beautiful and other people were trying to invite her out and seduce her, wouldn't you get angry? I saw these jerks and schmucks coming out with lines and it bothered me, but I never really and truly hit my wives. If I had hit them properly, they would be dead."
Well, one day Pete Savage went to visit the LaMottas, and their conversation was actually described by Jake in his book. And Pete asked Jake why he had not received a title shot. Vicky, who had been making sandwiches in the other room, brought them in while they were talking and answered the question, as quoted in Jake's book. Because he thinks he's so smart, that's why. He could have been a champ for the last 3 years, but he knows more than anybody else. He isn't going to play ball with anybody. He isn't. And Jake snapped, "Oh, shut up. I told you to keep your mouth shut about that. Just like every broad, shooting your mouth off. Well, shoot it off about something else besides my business." LaMotta directed his verbal assault at Vicky. Now, when speaking of the conversation later, he added, "That's a wife for you. Drilling the old needle in the same old spot, in that same sore tooth, even though she knew how goddamn mad it always made me." Now back to the ring, and Jake clocked up a 7-fight winning streak after that Ray Robinson defeat, and you could argue that only 2 were only keep busy fights. He took a dubious split decision against the brilliant and another Murderers Row member in Burt Lytell on April the 20th, 1945 at the St. Nick's Rink in New York, which, of course, again, as many of these fights were, was booed by a majority of the crowd. Many ringside experts believed that Lytell won convincingly. However, LaMotta was given the nod. A UD against Tommy Bell followed, with then a 9th round stoppage of Jose Bazora again, before stopping again George Cochin in the same round in their 3rd meeting. Then it was the 5th fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, 56 1-1, which was scheduled for 12 rounds, a first for both men. It happened in Chicago's Comiskey Park, a stadium that could hold many more fans than the Olympia in Detroit or Madison Square Garden in New York.
The fight generated more money in Chicago. Robinson earned $25,000 and LaMotta just under $20,500, giving more fans the chance to see these two dance again. The International News Service reported LaMotta had counted on the 12-round route as his chance for victory, as he had closed strongly in his 4 previous bouts with Robinson. But the Negro welterweight proved he could go more than 10 rounds at top speed. Robinson piled up an early lead with his superior boxing and sharper punching, and then paced himself cleverly through the rest of the fight. The Associated Press wrote, "The crowd of 14,755 booed the split decision, presumably because Robinson had elected to fight cautiously in the last 3 rounds and backpedaled most of the way in the closing sessions." After the fight, Robinson admitted, "This was the toughest fight I've ever had with LaMotta." They had been through 52 rounds of ferocious boxing together, and not once had the great Sugar Ray Robinson been able to floor Jake LaMotta to the canvas. Although Jake prided himself on that fact, he said years later, "The only thing I really wanted was that title." Jake had fought 64 times professionally and closed the year with 3 straight victories, taking his career record to 55-10-2. Yet, he had not fought for a world title. His claim took another major dent after securing 3 more victories to start the year, when on April 3rd, 1946, Uncle Mike Jacobs confirmed that Tony Zale would fight Rocky Graziano for the world middleweight title. He announced that the pair had been matched to meet in the Yankee Stadium on July 25th for a 15-rounder. Considering that his old pal Rocky had come out of nowhere to secure a world title shot, must have been really a bitter pill to swallow for Jake La Motta.
To make it worse, Rocky stuck the knife in as well when he replied to a question about facing La Motta. He said, "I could always beat him in reform school." On top of that disappointment, he also watched on as his most fierce rival, Sugar Ray Robinson, finally won a welterweight world title against Tommy Bell, a guy he also decisioned a month later. After Jake recorded 2 back-to-back wins in March and May, he drew with the tough Jimmy Edgar in their third meeting in June 46. Next was the third Black Murderers Row member in Holman Williams on August the 7th of 46 at the University of Detroit Stadium in Detroit. And the 25-year-old now, Jake La Motta, took a 10-round UD decision before a sellout crowd of 16,000. Referee Johnny Webber called it 53-47, while the 2 judges gave it 56-44 and 52-48, all to Jake La Motta, and the decision was booed by many spectators who saw the 35-year-old Williams actually take a substantial lead in the early rounds. But La Motta made a game comeback in the latter stages, a fight of 2 halves by the sound of it. A month later, when Jake was at his best against a guy called Bob Satterfield, another tough fighter of the time in Chicago. And the Associated Press wrote this: "So Satterfield held La Motta on even terms in the early rounds, having his best moment in the 4th when he shook La Motta to his heels with a right hand. Satterfield did not follow up though, and La Motta began to take over the bout. In the 6th round, La Motta chased Satterfield across the ring with a sustained attack. In the 7th, a left to the armpit actually appeared to stagger La Motta, and Satterfield soon showed signs of weariness as he dropped his hands and began to be pounded by Jake La Motta, who landed at will on him. A left hook to the jaw sent Satterfield to his knees, where he fell on his back to be counted out by the referee Dave Miller."
Now moving away from the ring, and Jake and Vicky got married in 1946, and the new Mrs. La Motta said the first year of the marriage was a good one. She said Jake was a good cook, and that they hosted dinner parties together. They dined with Jake's family, and she hit it off with Jake's father. They went to the movies, horseback riding, and for long walks in the snow. He patiently taught Vicky how to drive. During this period, his young bride loved sharing these activities. On occasions, Jake would shower her with spontaneous gifts. He was a man in love, and Vicky said he called her his pretty baby. I was his doll. But over time, his behaviour became controlling. Vicky said, "He was all-consuming. He lived as part of me. If I went to visit my mother or father, Jake had to be there. If I wanted to speak to someone, Jake was at my side. If I needed groceries, Jake wanted to go to the store with me. If the telephone rang, Jake had to answer it. Every aspect of my life was under his control." At first, Vicky, who was young and naive, didn't mind, but she assumed that his behaviour was because Jake loved her. But then, he did not want her to have any money, saying he would go with her and pay. Next, he did not even want her to talk to servicemen, such as butchers, because they were guys. Vicky nearly flipped when Jake did not want her to talk to female friends without him being within earshot. Vicky said she asked him why he had behaved in such an iron-fisted and controlling manner, and he responded by saying, "I didn't want you to be with other people because I thought they'd put ideas in your head. I wanted to train you, so you only knew what I wanted you to know."
But Vicky said years later, that was Jake. I was a possession, and the prize he was afraid to let anyone touch. Basically treated like a dog. That's basically how he treated her. Now back to the ring, and Jake won 2 fights to end the year. He now deserved a shot at the title, but the mobsters, who allowed him to fight whoever he wanted to, as long as the title was on the line, it didn't matter. He just wasn't going to get the chance. And as Lou Friedman explained, sometimes they would take aside his brother, Joey, and let him know that if La Motta cooperated with them, he would get a shot at the middleweight title. Sometimes the mobsters talked to his best friend, Pete Savage, and asked him to deliver the same message. Occasionally, they would even summon Jake himself to a meeting and tell him the same thing. He would spurn them, walk out on them, and just pretty much insult them. They often implied threats about La Motta's well-being. He was told that he may be famous as a highly rated boxer, known far and wide, but he was still not bigger than they were. But Jake, he was never assaulted. They knew he would buckle eventually, but first, he kick-started 1947 with a win, a third UD over Tommy Bell. He then outpointed Tony Gennaro on June 6 at Madison Square Garden. For those that have watched that movie, Raging Bull, they will remember that famous scene when Robert De Niro, who played La Motta, was moaning about how he had to get down to 150 pounds to fight Tony Gennaro. And Joe Pesci, who played Joey, Jake's brother, comes back with the great line, "If you win, you win. If you lose, you still win. There's no way you can lose. Stop eating, you fat bastard." At this point in his career, Jake was a tremendous fighter, one of the best middleweights around at the time, and one of the best of all time. However, his skills were limited. But where he lacked in finesse and defensive skills, he excelled in entertainment, his heart, will, and absolute desire.
Kevin Mitchell explains Jake's boxing style perfectly when he wrote, "La Motta is the nearest thing to an animal boxing has ever seen. Stumpy, strong, bobbing up and down as if moving through the jungle in search of food. Jake stalked his prey, splay-legged, as his short, hairy arms carved a wide, venomous arc, and with only cursory regard for his own health. It was fighting without craft. It lacked any self-consciousness, and it was driven by a mix of bravery and foolishness." Jake always protested he had little or nothing to do with the mob, and that if they came calling, he would have nothing to do with them. In 1947, Jake only fought 4 times in his most inactive year as a professional, and as was the problem before the Gennaro fight, Jake ballooned up in weight between fights, so by the time he entered the ring, he looked sluggish and wasn't as ferocious as he had been previously. It would seem that his desire had wilted due to the lack of world title opportunities, plus seeing Rocky Graziano win the middleweight world title must have angered him. This was reflected in his poor showing against Cecil Hudson, who weighed 155 pounds at Comiskey Park in Chicago on September 3rd, 1947. The Associated Press wrote that La Motta, who showed only flashes of his old-time form, but was outboxed from the start to finish by Hudson. Despite his 10-pound pulling weight, La Motta staggered Hudson only twice and was badly tired at the finish. The report then said, in much better condition than La Motta, Hudson repeatedly landed 3 or 4 stiff lefts before La Motta could counter. Trying desperately for a knockout in the final round, La Motta then found range, but his punches lacked steam. He ended up going on to lose a split decision, but his rhythm, timing and fitness was clearly lacking.
And with no manager or any connections, Jake seemed to be going nowhere and could not secure a match for that world title. Again, author Kevin Mitchell explained that there is a myth at large that at this stage of his career, La Motta was a struggling middleweight waiting in the queue for a world title shot. But that wasn't the reality, as he had suggested back in 1944 during the Civic Rivalry, he had already made a lot of money from boxing. He had now been in the game for 6.5 years and had 78 fights but no title, as we keep mentioning. That was the only carrot the mob could now wave in his face. It certainly wasn't the money that drove Jake to make the decision he made, hence why he rejected a hefty pay deal from the mob. One day, Joey, his brother, approached him and said that there was $100,000 on the table if he threw a fight against Billy Fox at Madison Square Garden. The implication was that the bribe had actually came from Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo themselves, and Blinky Palermo was actually the manager of Billy Fox. But according to Jake himself, he told them where to stick it. At this point, he had invested in 2 boxing clubs. Now, the Jerome Stadium across the street from Yankee Stadium and the Park Arena in East Bronx. However, he was not the owner on record because it was believed that it was a conflict of interest for a boxer to own places in which he might be able to use as boxing venues for himself. Now, the clubs, according to the taxman, were the property of another retired boxer, Joey La Motta. Now, we will come to why one of these boxing clubs are important in a moment. But the point for now is that Jake was wealthy, even when he wasn't a world champion.
The mob knew that money wouldn't be enough to force Jake into fixing a fight, so they promised him a shot at the world title if he threw a fight against Billy Fox. La Motta said, "What was I going to do? Fight the mob for the rest of my life?" This was the establishment. What they say went. I'd been fighting them now for 4 years, and where had it gotten me? So, Jake La Motta made one of the biggest decisions of his boxing career and life. He accepted to take a dive, even though this was going to hurt his pride. He battled with this decision for weeks leading up to the fight. Then, he was given an opportunity to go back on his decision after a torrid sparring session. His partner hurt La Motta to the body, and he was positive that the punch had broken a rib. When a doctor examined him, he was told that the injury was not a broken rib, but actually a ruptured spleen, and that he could not fight. He was advised by the doctor to go home and rest. This was an out for Jake, a way to conveniently back out of the Fox bout and his deal with the mob. Joey planned to notify Madison Square Garden officials about the injury, but Jake told him not to and kept the injury quiet. Other sources have suggested that it was this injury that empowered Jake to request that his brother Joey reopen negotiations with the mobsters after he had initially rejected them. But it doesn't really matter. What we do know for certain is that he agreed to take a dive against Billy Fox. Now, we are going to use information from the book Jacob's Beach, The Mob, The Garden and the Golden Age of Boxing, which was written by Kevin Mitchell, who explains what happened next. On the night of Tuesday, November the 11th, 1947, Armistice Day, Jake was at the Park Arena.
And Jake was pretending not to be the governor by shaking hands, nonetheless, as punters steamed in to watch what could not be declared was actually one of his shows, because obviously he was a fighter and could own a boxing club. Now, top of the bill was a local lightweight called Frankie, sometimes Freddie Palermo, who got a unanimous decision over Jimmy Pierce in an 8-rounder. But this night was significant not for the boxing, but for the clientele. Jake's special guests who arrived at the rundown ghetto in chauffeured comfort and safety were Blinky Palermo, not related to the lightweight fighter by the way, apparently, and Frankie Carbo. Now, this was boxing royalty, two of the game's rarely seen elite. Their habitat was more often in the dining room of the Forest Hotel in 49th Street, where they would eat and drink and talk with Mike Jacobs from across the road from the Garden. About this time, though, Uncle Mike was not always on call. He had had a cerebral hemorrhage in 1946, so taking care of business for him in the 20th Century Sports Club was his lawyer and cousin, Sal Strauss. A couple of months before this or that Armistice Day of 1947, Strauss had actually spoken with Blinky about an up-and-coming fight at the Garden between Jake La Motta and Palermo's seemingly tough prospect, Billy Blackjack Fox, a lean, young hitter from Philadelphia who had knocked out 42 of 43 mostly anonymous opponents, losing the one serious examination of his credentials to the world light heavyweight champion Gus Lesnovich by stoppage that February. The match was made for Friday, November the 14th. Fox would get 20% of the gate, Jake 30%. It seemed a straightforward piece of business. Two top-class fighters headlining a big bill at the Garden. Now here they were, 3 days before the scheduled meeting of Fox and La Motta, Blinky and Frankie in this dump watching Blinky's namesake against Jimmy Irish Pierce, Or maybe they were there to see the rising heavyweight, Roland Lestraza.
Lestraza would go on to get knocked out by Rocky Marciano, but at this point, he had been boxing for just 4 months, and this would be his 9th straight win. Blinky and Frankie ghosted into the arena, shook Jake's hand, and ignoring the undercard action, retreated to a quiet corner to talk. With them were his brother Joey, the brilliantly named promoter Honest Bill Daly, and a PR flack called Billy Stevens, one of the fight writers happy to pick up the envelope left for him in his press seat. As the gutsy New York boxing writer Barney Nagler observed, they were gaudily open-handed. The mobsters in the business usually were as cosy as dope pushers about their activities in boxing, but Cabo and Palermo had chosen to consort with LaMotta in a public fight club on a fight night when officials of the New York State Athletic Commission were near enough to smell them. 3 nights later, Friday the 14th of November, LaMotta did what he always said he would never do. He threw a fight. He threw it so badly, even he was embarrassed. It should have been a spectacular contest, but it turned out to be anything but. Before the fight, odds had shifted because the bookies heard whispers that the fight was going to be fixed. Some stopped taking bets altogether, and Jake La Motta said, "In case you don't know, something like that, as in talk of a fix, gets around the world I live in like lightning." They, as in the bookies, got a sense of smell about things like that. Now into the fight, and as early as halfway through the first round, La Motta later claimed, "I don't know how we even got through the first round without me murdering him. Sometimes I thought the air from my punches was affecting him."
So Jake La Motta confessed, "I began to panic a little. I was supposed to be throwing a fight to this guy, and it looked like I was going to be holding him up on his feet. He discovered that throwing this fight in a convincing way was going to be harder than he anticipated. After hitting Fox a couple of times to make things look good, he noticed to his horror that his opponent was rocking on his feet. La Motta had to dive in and hold the other fighter upright until Fox's head cleared. By the 4th round, the crowd's suspicions had turned to certainties. They were booing and screaming and demanding their money back as the 2 boxers played out the charade in the ring. Finally, in desperation, La Motta backed to the ropes and dropped his arms to his side, allowing Fox to hit him at will. Even then, Fox did not have the power to put him down. La Motta started weaving and staggering in an effort to simulate extreme exhaustion. At last, the referee moved in and stopped the contest in favour of Fox. Jake hadn't been a convincing loser, although he tried to explain to anyone that would listen that it was just a bad day. And he said, "I don't know how long it's been since you stood up on the platform and listened to about 20,000 people booing you, but I personally didn't like it, and the knowledge that I deserved it didn't help." There wasn't a person in the building who didn't know Jake had thrown this fight, so it was inevitable that there was an immediate investigation. He did such a rubbish job that the New York State Athletic Commission and the local district attorney began investigating, and the fight purse was held up. Jake was able to save himself by providing a doctor's diagnosis for a ruptured spleen.
Jake claimed that he had been in such pain from his injury that he had been unable to fight properly against Fox. The commission did not believe his testimony, but was unable to prove anything. Joey took to the stand the following day and said he'd heard rumours of a fix. "All the time, all day people come over to me and different people asked me, 'There's a rumour going around your brother is going to throw the fight,' and I said, 'My brother never threw a fight. He never intends to throw a fight.' Then Palermo gave evidence. No, he said, he had not seen La Motta at Park Arena 3 nights before the fight. In fact, he couldn't remember if he'd been to the Park Arena or not, and he said, 'I have been in quite a few different places.' Other witnesses, including Al Savani, Jake's sometime trainer and actor, and Frank Sinatra's masseur, he hadn't heard anything either. The referee, Frank Fulham, described the fight in his testimony, and he said, 'In the 4th round, when I stopped the fight, it was one-sided from the start. Fox rushed La Motta all over the ring, throwing both left and right hooks to the body and head without any return from La Motta. I only stopped the contest after it was evident to me that La Motta was unable to defend himself. I also felt that any further punishment might bring serious injury to La Motta. I want to state that during the course of the 3 rounds and 2 minutes and 26 seconds in the 4th round, when I stopped the contest, during that time La Motta could have gone down from several hard blows he received from Fox, but refused to do so, especially when he was in the corner and one of his knees nearly touched the canvas.
Frank Fulham continued, "As a referee of many contests, I thought that La Motta showed great durability to survive the punishment that he took. If I didn't stop the fight, it would have been a tragedy, and perhaps the fellow might have been killed. As a representative of the commission, I am there to see that it is an honest, fair fight and to see that the boys are not hurt." Years later, Jake wrote in his autobiography, "If there was anyone in the garden who didn't know what was happening, he must have been dead drunk." The investigation was going nowhere, so the assistant DA, Alfred Scotty, got involved. He called in Palermo and Carbo to his office in Leonard Street, and they told him nothing. He also questioned Jake, but he denied to ever borrowing money from Frankie Carbo. He did admit to putting $10,000 of his own money into the Park Arena, but said he took it from his ring earnings, which he never liked to put in the bank, preferring to look after his cash himself in his apartment. The upshot was that Jake escaped with a $1,000 fine and a 7-month suspension in New York for failing to report his injury. And that was that for now anyway. The bout with Fox had been so corrupt that there was no possibility of him getting a world title shot. So Jake had to wait another 18 months for all the controversy to die down before he received his reward for throwing the fight. When author Kevin Mitchell was investigating his book, he was fascinated on this era and the fight fixing and whatever else happened in his time, and he wanted to know more. And he explained that one night in Manhattan, in an Irish bar near the Garden, I was talking to an old operator, an ever-laughing acquaintance called Burt Randolph Sugar, who has insinuated himself into every corner of the fight game.
Mitchell said he wondered what he made of La Motta and his contemporaries, the fighters and their handlers, the writers too, who had to get on with their work surrounded by unsmiling crooks with cold hearts and no real love of the sport. He quotes an old fight writer, Mario Rivera Martino, who wrote for The Ring as long ago as 1945. He told Burt once, "Yeah, the fights were fixed, the fights were crooked in the old days, the mob had them. But then you had the better fights," Sugar said. "I mean, it's not my observation, but I agree. A lot of these guys, they weren't connected, but they could come in if they wanted, and then they got connected." Mitchell asked, "And, once you were in, the scam was the rematch, right?" Burt Sugar agreed and said, "But it was also a betting proposition. A fighter was making 30,000, let's say, maybe 20. Up front, according to the declared purse, you'd give them 15 or 10. You could lay off twice that. You pocket the difference. He's got more money and he's told, 'Let's go. You'll get another fight, Joe.' I mean, when Jake did it, he didn't even tell his dad, who lost all his money on him." Back to Jake, and during the 7 months out of the ring, he became paranoid with everyone. His pride had been taken away from him. Vicky said this of Jake: "The thing he was proudest of was being an honest fighter, and now that had gone." He confided in no one, Vicky said. "Jake never told me he threw the fight. At that time, knowing how proud he was to be a fighter, I never dreamed he'd do it. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I shut my eyes to what was going on around me."
Vicky said she did not learn for certain that Jake had through the fight with Billy Fox until 13 years later. Now, his paranoia gradually got worse. The ring was the one place Jake laid everything on the table. He could forget about Harry Gordon, the man he still thought he had murdered, the boy that died when he hit him with his car, almost killing his ex-wife, and obviously that horrific rape of Viola. He had managed to keep a lid on all these demons, but they were all come racing to the surface at this point. In the book Raging Bull, Vicky was quoted in a conversation with Pete, his best mate, and this is how it read. "You were telling me once about how he doesn't trust anybody, not even his own brother," asked Pete. Vicky replied, "Well, he doesn't trust me either, and I'm his wife. It's like living in a goddamn jail, I tell you. I can't even breathe without him wanting to know why. If he even thinks I have a wrong thought, he uses me as a punching bag." She then trusted in Pete and suggested that she did not love Jake as much as she used to, and said, "He's just punched the love out of me. I'm afraid of him. I'm not joking when I say I'm afraid he'll lose his temper so bad one day that he really will kill me." These were bad times for Vicky and for Jake, if you can show any remorse for him at all. He became known in the neighbourhood and in some others as Jake the Fake, which really hurt his pride. In Vicky's memory, her husband was a wreck during his enforced layoff, not knowing what to do with himself and distraught over his predicament. She said the next 7 months were among the worst of Jake's life. He stayed indoors alone and wouldn't talk to anybody.
Vicky said Jake refused to go out because he was ashamed to be seen on the streets. He was a changed person, horribly depressed and unhappy with life. Then brother Joey was sent to deliver a message to Jake that the time had come at last for him to challenge for the middleweight title. Jake never thought he would hear those words. It was due to him for all the blood, sweat and tears he had invested in the sport. As the end of the suspension period approached, Joey came over to the house one day. They were out front when he told LaMotta that he had received word from the gangsters that once Jake was back in action and had polished off a few guys, he would get his opportunity. Jake said, "This was it. This was my chance." I jumped on Joey and began wrestling with him, and we both went down on the grass. Eventually, the ban was over, and Jake resumed his career with a bout on June 1st, 1948, against Ken Stribling. LaMotta fought 9 times before he got a shot at the middleweight title, and not all of those bouts were stay-busy fights, and not all of them were victories either. LaMotta beat Stribling, Bill Charity, Johnny Colan, Vern Lester, Tommy Yarosh, Laurent Dathul, Robert Villemain, O'Neill Bell, and Joey DeJohn, and a few others. It took split decisions to conquer Lester and Villemain, and LaMotta lost a unanimous decision to Dathul in Montreal. He was worried that loss would push him back down the line of contenders, but his brother Joey said he had spoken to the man and been reassured that type of defeat would not cost him his opportunity.
However, it wasn't the defeat to Dufresne that was the most significant. It was the split decision win over Frenchman Villemain on March 21st, 1949 at Madison Square Garden. Such was the commotion over their first meeting that the New York State Athletic Commission chairman, Eddie Egan, shocked the Boxing Society when 3 days after the bout, he suspended the referee, Harry Ebbets, and one of the 2 judges, Harold Barnes, indefinitely. It was Mr. Egan's opinion that, in view of the international importance of the bout and the fact that their cards were contrary to the viewpoint of particularly all those who witnessed the contest, especially the members of the commission, it was felt that disciplinary action was required. Ebbets actually scored the rounds 6-4 and 2 for LaMotta. Barnes gave it 6-5 and 1. The other judge, Charlie Shortell, saw it 7-4 and 1 for Villemain. 12 of 13 fight writers pulled at ringside gave it to Villemain. The Garden crowd again shouted "fixed" into the New York night. There were no arguments for LaMotta or his handlers, but a lot of rightful moaning from the Frenchman's corner. He would never get his hands on a world title, nor even have the opportunity to do so. They would meet again before the year was out, but first, Jake's time had finally arrived to fight for the world title, which was now held by the brilliant Frenchman Marcel Cerdan with an impressive career record of 110 wins and just 3 defeats. He had stopped Tony Zhao in 11 rounds in September 1948 and was making his first defence of the title against Jake La Motta. The mob had delivered what they promised to Jake La Motta, but there were a few catches along the way.
His brother Joey hinted that his underworld connections were taking a keen interest in the bout and that they needed $20,000 to make sure that the contest went ahead. Jake gave his brother the money, even though he was only getting $19,000 for the bout. Therefore, it actually cost Jake $1,000 to fight for the world middleweight title. On the side, though accepting odds of 8-5 against him by bookies, Jake placed a $10,000 bet on himself to win. He also had to guarantee the Frenchman a return bout in case he won and sign a personal services contract of 3 years' duration with the International Boxing Club in New York, who were effectively a corporation that was run by the mob using frontmen. Not only had Jake submitted to the mob, he was now under their control. They let him fight for the title, but if he won it, they would still own it, and own Jake for 3 years. As the weeks, days and hours counted down, Jake was like a kid in a sweet shop, and he said, this was extra special on the account of the fact that Cerdan was a Frenchman. Americans are so used to taking it for granted that they're the only top-ranked fighters, at least from the class of, say, welterweight on, that when a real top-notch foreign fighter comes along, there's a special atmosphere built up. A fight like that builds and builds till finally it's the night of the fight, the hour of the fight, and almost the minute of the fight. And now here's the time you've been waiting for ever since, well, in my case, ever since I can remember. Ever since I was a kid.
Right around the time the Cerdan fight was scheduled, Vicky and Jake had a baby girl, and it seemed like the stars were aligning. The fight for the NBA, the ring, and the lineal middleweight titles took place at the Briggs Stadium in Detroit, Michigan. Jake was less than a month shy of his 28th birthday and was finally getting his chance, and he was not going to let this slip away, even though the fight was actually postponed for a day because of heavy rain. Vicky recalled, the morning of the Cerdan fight, Jake sat me down in our hotel suite and said, I want you at ringside. You have to be there. I've waited my entire life for this. He was very calm, not at all nervous. He was waiting for Cerdan with the same anticipation that a child has waiting for Christmas. There's no chance I'll be hurt. I'm going to win, he said. Jake also invited Father Joseph to the fight, the man that had directed him to boxing while in reform school as well. From the off, there was controversy when Cerdan injured his left shoulder in the first round after being thrown to the canvas by LaMotta. But in truth, LaMotta nearly knocked the champ out right away with a left hook to the face that propelled him against the ropes. There were no fouls, and officials indicated that it was a clean fight. Cerdan was bleeding from his right eye before the end of the first round and bled from the bridge of his nose by the end of the second. Writer Red Smith reported, in spite of his injury and in spite of severe beating in the first round, Cerdan won the second round big, and the third and fifth by lesser margins. A master at handling his opponent, turning him, tying him up, slipping or blocking his punches and setting him up. Cerdan could do none of this with one hand.
Red Smith continued and said he couldn't even stick his left out to ward off his foe. It is difficult to believe LaMotta would have a chance with a two-handed Cerdan. However, the New York Times wrote, Cerdan was so weakened he didn't know where his corner was as the 7th and 8th rounds ended. Indeed, the 8th round found Cerdan in disorderly retreat that indicated clearly he would not last. The Ring magazine noted, each personified gameness by his showing. From the very start of the bout, LaMotta became the aggressor, and seldom did he give way to the defending champion. He switched from a body attack to a head attack, and when he saw that Cerdan's defence for the face was nil due to his inability to use his left. Both the Times and the Ring reports was right. The French hero Cerdan had to retire on his stool after the 9th round due to suffering from a separated shoulder in round 2. Just about the sweetest words Jake La Motta ever heard were uttered over the loudspeaker as the announcer introduced him to the Detroit crowd as the winner by knockout and the new champion, Jake La Motta. The new champion recalled the scene at the Brick Stadium afterwards and said, "It was bedlam, of course, but the kind of bedlam you want to last forever. What I had now was the gold and jewel-studded championship belt that Joe Louis presented to me, the belt I'd waited all my life for, and the crowd all slapping me on the back and telling me what a great guy I was." After the fight, Jake had a sizable swelling on top of his left hand, around the middle finger, and he admitted, "I don't know which round I hurt the left, maybe the third or fourth. I think it's a fracture." Now, despite the injured hand, La Motta landed 104 blows in the 9th round, whereas Sedan scarcely threw a punch.
And Vicky recalled her husband's performance as well, and she said she called it a thing of beauty to watch. Jake had been born to win the middleweight championship of the world, and that night he was overpowering. His attitude, his conditioning, everything about him was perfect that night. His entire life had been aimed toward that moment. Jake described the moment as this: "I cannot describe it exactly what I felt. I felt like, God had given me the world. It was absolute pandemonium. There was booing, I could hear that, but the whole place was filled with cheering for me, the reform school kid from the Bronx." Then, as Lou Friedman explained, the strangest thing happened. Of all the places, at all the most despondent of times, peering through the crowd surrounding him was someone La Motta recognised, someone from his distant past. He couldn't even quite identify the man at first. True realisation brought shock. Everyone had joined to La Motta's hotel for a party, when naturally he was the centre of attention, feted and toasted with champagne. Suddenly, standing there, just a few feet away from him, now talking to him, was a ghost. Harry Gordon, the bookie he had killed, was right there congratulating him. La Motta noted that the man had a crisscross of ugly, livid scars on his forehead. The man said hello, using his old nickname for Jake, which was Giacobbe. He did not recognise the man at first. Then he reacted as if seeing a ghost. It was Harry Gordon. So Harry Gordon had actually came over to pay his respects to the new champ. Jake said, Jesus Christ, Holy Mother of God, Harry Gordon the book." Gordon turned to his mate and basically said, "See, I told you La Motta would remember me from the neighbourhood."
At first he was speechless. Then, without thinking, but safe in the knowledge that Harry had made news by being killed, Jake said, Harry, you're dead. You're dead, you son of a bitch. I saw it in the paper myself. You're dead." Gordon just burst out laughing and reassured Jake that he was indeed alive and asked for a glass of champagne for him and his friend. Gordon then ran through the incident. He said he would have given whoever assaulted him whatever money he was carrying, and that the robber botched the whole thing anyway by missing out on the $1,700 he had hidden. Gordon told La Motta the newspapers got the story wrong in one important detail. Yes, he had been assaulted. Yes, the thief missed the books. But no, he did not die. Gordon said, "They printed I was dead instead of only dying. There were even telegrams sent out to the relatives and friends. They came to sit Shiva, which is the Jewish mourning ritual, but I fooled them all, and I bet some of them weren't too happy." Gordon said he spent 6 weeks in the hospital, one step from the morgue, he said. But when released, he went to Florida to live and thus was never seen in the Bronx again. The irony is that Harry became a huge fan of Jake's because he knew him from his old neighbourhood. And although Jake was relieved that he wasn't a murderer, he was still struggling to accept the world title was legitimate. And he said, "I'm the champ, but look what I had to do to get it," referring to, of course, the Billy Fox fix. Vicky said years later, it was a dirty championship because of the Billy Fox fight.
Vicky said that I honestly believe Jake felt inside that once he was champion, the sun would shine every day. He'd be happy all the time and life would be perfect. But the world doesn't work that way. and having won the title, he was still depressed without knowing why. His first defence would be against the former champion in the immediate rematch. LaMotta Sedan 2 was scheduled for Madison Square Garden on September the 28th, and the contract was signed by Sedan before he even left the country. He said, "I'll go home in about 2 weeks, then I'll come back here." Sedan returned and prepared for the rematch, but then Jake injured his neck, so the fight was rescheduled to December the 2nd, so the Frenchman returned home for a while. Sedan chose to fly out on the Air France plane from Paris, France on October the 27th, 1949, and after a scheduled stop at Santa Maria Airport in the Azores, or they would arrive in New York City. However, the plane crashed into the mountain in San Miguel Island. There were 48 people on board, 37 of them passengers and 11 of them crew members, and they all perished. Technically, Sedan's death was on October the 28th because the plane crashed at almost 3 a.m. European Central Time. When Jake was told of the news of the crash, he optimistically said, "My mother has been praying, lighting candles for the safety of our friend." However, Sedan wasn't coming back. He died, along with everyone else on that plane. Jake spent 6 months away from the ring, and in that time, he grew an ego. He trained less and he drank more. And Vicky said, well, he was the champ, why not have a drink? And then another, which is death for a fighter. Soon he was losing the motivation to train. He'd say, "I'm not doing road work today. Instead of running, I'll spar an extra round in the gym." He wasn't hungry anymore. The edge was gone.
Jake admitted, "The drive had gone out of me, and worst of all, I was beginning to get bored by it all. But I was still going to remain champion for as long as I could. I felt that if I had to, I could always push the right buttons and become as vicious and as mean as I had to be. I had been conditioned too long and too hard to suddenly lose that. But it just wasn't the same as being a mean, cruel bastard every minute of the day just because you believed yourself to be." LaMotta was at the height of his powers and now rubbing shoulders with the mob, as Vicky believed, rather than fighting against them. They also picked his next opponent. It was a non-title fight against another Frenchman that he had already beaten, very controversially, Robert Villemain. Jake was not in any fit state to take on such a solid opponent, and so he lost, emphatically to the Frenchman. About as clearly as Villemain had slaughtered LaMotta earlier in the year without getting the verdict, also at the same venue, Madison Square Garden. He felt justified at last in beating LaMotta, and he had a passionate Associated Press writer blowing his trumpet afterwards, when they wrote, "Robert Villemain officially has evened his score with Jake La Motta. Now the scrappy little Frenchman wants the middleweight champion to put his title on the line. Villemain, a 5'6.5" bundle of perpetual motion, poured it on the slowed-up Bronx Bull last night to win a unanimous 10-round decision in MSG. That squared accounts for the 25-year-old Parison, who licked Jake in the Garden last March but lost the decision. The verdict, one of the rankest in years, resulted in the suspension of 2 officials who voted LaMotta."
Well, Jake was out of shape and needed to gradually get himself back down to middleweight. So the plan was for him to fight as a light heavyweight and slowly bring his weight down safely, so he was ready for his first defence. So from February to May 1950, Jake fought 3 times. He stopped Dick Wagner and Chuck Hunter and then outpointed Joe Taylor in 10 rounds. His next fight would be a first defence against Italian Terribo Matri at Madison Square Garden. However, the Italian was actually brought in as a late substitute because Jake was all set to meet his old friend Rocky Graziano in his first defence, but Graziano had to pull out. It was the closest to 2 old acquaintances from the streets of New York and Coxsackie Prison came to fight for a championship belt. Jake looked at a Graziano fight as a big money spinner, one that would have divided allegiances all round New York. He said, "The minute I even mentioned the Graziano fight, all I got was static. First of all, from Rocky, of all people, I couldn't figure him out. It almost happened. The deal had been signed, the hype had begun, but only days into the workouts, the fight was called off because Graziano broke his hand in training. That was the end of that. Many years later, appearing on televised boxing show, La Motta was asked who would have won between him and Graziano, and he replied, "It would have been a rough bout. I would have licked him." Jake made a successful defence against the unknown Mitri, but it was a gruelling 15-rounder that made La Motta just look pretty ordinary, and it put a bullseye on his back as a fighter to be taken down. Jake put it down to Mitri just being an awkward fighter to finish off. But whatever the reason, it didn't matter. He was still the world champion.
Jake's second defence was agreed, and it would be against another Frenchman in a rematch against Laurent Dathoulet on September the 13th, 1950 in Detroit. Before the fight, Jake recalled the argument he had with his brother Joey in the film Raging Bull, which went like this. Joey accused his brother of being lacklustre, and he said the trouble is, you get through a fight, you chase around too much, you eat too much of that pasta, you drink too much booze. I ain't fighting for the title. Go ahead and blow it. See if I care. What the hell's the use? You're going to blow it to somebody sometime anyway. What the hell has got it into you? You're not the same fighter you used to be. Jake became enraged and said, "What do you mean? I'm not the same fighter I was." To which Joey responded, "You got no zing," meaning he had become sloppy. Now into the fight, and we are going to use the write-up for the fight that was printed in the book, The Ultimate Book of Boxing Lists by Burt Randolph Sugar and Teddy Atlas. They actually concentrate on the very last round because it was one of the greatest rounds in boxing history. And it reads, challenger Laurent Dathoulet had taken the fight to the defending middleweight champion La Motta, the Frenchman piling up points on the slower moving La Motta as he moved in and out with ease. As the bell rang for the 15th and final round, the bruised and battered champion come off his stool, squinting through the narrow slit that once was his left eye. Mindful of his corner's instructions that he'd have to knock the frog out, though far ahead on the scorecards, Dathoulet had inexplicably been told to go in and fight. However, it has also been noted that Jaime Blaustein, who was in Dathoulet's corner, said, "Stay away and box. Easy. Easy, you have the title."
Well, whatever the instructions, whatever the correct instructions were, we were not quite sure. It had no effect, as the report continued, and it said, during an exchange near the end of the final round, Dathoulet stepped back to survey his handiwork. It was the last look he got. For with fewer than 45 seconds remaining in the fight, La Motta caught Dathoulet with one deep dish beauty of a left. Dathoulet staggered backwards, with Jack in pursuit, throwing a varied assault of lefts and rights, all of which connected. Finally, La Motta felled the challenger with one long looping left, draping Dathoulet over the bottom rope where he was counted out with only 13 seconds of the fight to go. It came out later through the 14 rounds. The scores for Dathoulet read 72-68, 74-66 and 73-67. Not even close. Dathoulet had it in the bag. He was walking away with La Motta's crown. Jake actually recalled afterwards that when he dropped his hands in my corner, I knew I had him. Well, the sixth fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, now 121 wins, 1 loss and 2 draws, was signed for Valentine's Day 1951 in early January. And Vicky La Motta said her husband weighed 177 pounds. Jake said it was actually more worse than that. It was 187 pounds. Jake had to lose 17 pounds by the weigh-in. This is when Vicky recalled a particular moment, and maybe even almost sinister, shortly after Jake won that title. She claimed a doctor contacted him and told him he had a substance made from the juices of a bull that was produced in Italy, and it would greatly increase his strength if he took the injections. It sounded unbelievable, but Vicky said Jake was swayed by the argument that he could become strong like a real bull. She said right away he was taking the shots. There was no way of knowing so many years later, and even Jake would probably not know if those shots were early versions of steroids.
Vicky said when she did research and was told little was known about the ingredients and their effects, but the substance could cause cancer. Jake had strong reactions to the drugs, and she pleaded with him to stop the injections, but it was too late. He believed they worked. She recalled he overdosed once and that Jake's face actually turned blue and his feet were icy cold. The quantities also made it more difficult for La Motta to lose weight that he needed to lose. Vicky said a doctor told her that the drugs were no good for Jake. He gained excessive water weight, but she said when she relayed the doctor's report, Jake brushed her off by saying, "What do you know about boxing? I'm the champ. You mind your own business. I'll take care of the fighting." So recording the weight loss when Jake accelerated his crash diet of 1,500 calories a day for 4 weeks, he was boiling a steak and mixing the juice with water to create meat soup as a meal. Vicky knew Jake was going to have trouble on the scales. She said Jake was still at 164 plus and 4.5 pounds overweight the night before the weigh-in, and he stayed up all night in a steam room to hit the mark. Jake did it. He weighed in at 160 pounds, though likely he was quite weak from the endurance of losing the poundage. Robinson, who in the past had trouble gaining weight, weighed in at 155.5 pounds, reasonably close to the middleweight limit and for the first time much closer to Jake's weight. At the weigh-in, Robinson told La Motta, "Well, Jake, this is the 6th time we've met. This is for the championship. We have always gave a good fight. There will be a big crowd here tonight. Let's not let them down."
Well, Jake didn't seem interested at all in any of the patter and banter, and he replied, "Well, boy, you got to be the talker all at once. We get paid to fight, not talk." Ray actually drunk the blood from a steak to try and intimidate La Motta. Nothing's going to intimidate La Motta. He just thought it was a bit nuts. And for the first time in 52 3-minute rounds, Jake La Motta and Sugar Ray Robinson would fight for the world title on the line in front of a crowd of 14,802 at the Chicago Stadium. Ray was 29 years old and a 3-1 favourite. La Motta was 28 years old with a record of 78 wins, 14 losses and 3 draws. The challenger, Robinson, got 15% of the gate receipts, which was $20,840, plus $1,500 from television. La Motta earned 45% of the net, receiving $62,522 plus $1,500 from TV. The gross gate was over $180,000, yielded a net gate of $138,938. It was good money back then. Now, this was the 3rd defence of the middleweight title for Jake La Motta. He was hoping to avenge the 4 defeats he had suffered at the hands of the welterweight king. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds, but Jake didn't have it in him to go the distance after his long-term starvation program. We're going to use Lou Friedman to explain the action. Robinson was as light on his feet as ever, boxing with his effervescent style. La Motta, as always, stalked, coming forward relentlessly. For the first 8 rounds, Robinson picked away at Jake with ease and piled up points. But as was in his blood, Jake kept on coming. After the 8th round, Robinson was the boss. He pounded La Motta mercilessly and ceaselessly, cutting up La Motta's face, stopping him in his tracks and pummeling him against the ropes. La Motta was likely groggy, but he told himself one thing over and over again: he would not be knocked down.
At one point, his situation was so precarious, he actually wrapped his arm around a rope, nearly knotting it, to hold himself upright. By then, Vicky did not see nobility but horror. She said she was screaming and crying and ultimately praying, "Let it be over. Please let it end." The referee stopped the bout in the 13th round, and the United Press reported, at the close of the 8th round, the United Press had La Motta leading 6 rounds to 2. However, as La Motta tired and Robinson concentrated on an upsweeping attack of uppercuts, bolos and shovel hooks against his bobbing opponent, Jake began to wither under the rising fire. The fight was later described as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. When Vicky went to visit Jake in his dressing room, he was in a terrible state. She described blood pouring from his nose, mouth, face, and skin shredded by Robinson's repeated blows. Yet Jake repeated only one comment: "I never went down. I never went down." the words he was famously supposed to have uttered, according to Martin Scorsese in Raging Bull, was to Robinson during his beating. "You never got me down, Ray." Those words stand as a boxer's battle cry, even though, as his biographer Dave Anderson revealed years later, Jake never said them. New York Daily Mirror's Dan Parker wrote, "Beaten to a pulp by Ray Robinson, half blind with his title beyond hope of salvaging, Jake had one previous possession left and nothing but fierce pride to defend it with. Jake braced himself and helplessly took everything Robinson fired at him with fortitude that made the early Spartans seem cowardly. Jake had lost his world title, and their once evenly matched rivalry was no longer. Robinson was now far superior."
Jake once said this of Ray Robinson: "There's a curious relationship there. In one sense, he was the only guy I was never able to nail the way I wanted to nail. He was a nemesis to me, but on the other hand, his reputation was built on the fact that he had beaten me. Well, the beating was so severe that the idea of a rematch was dead in the water, and Jake even admitted years later, 'I didn't know it then, but that was really the end of my career.' The end was coming for Jake in the ring and his marriage with Vicky. It just wasn't clear which would occur first. Vicky said his paranoia had got even worse again after the Robinson defeat. She said the situation was intolerable. Vicky told a reporter that Jake had kept a diary when he switched from middleweight to light heavyweight. Among the words written by LaMotta in the diary were, "Alcohol seems to stay in your system and doesn't want to come out," and "drank too much and got sick. Also, ate bad, drunk bad, gained 8 pounds in one day." He actually weighed 195 pounds at this time. On June 27, 1951, 4 months after the Valentine's Day loss, or Valentine's Day Massacre, to Robinson, LaMotta met a guy called Bob Murphy at the Yankee Stadium in the light heavyweight division. LaMotta lost the fight because he was unable to come out for the 8th round. 6 months later, and Jake gave it another go, this time against Norman Hayes at the Boston Garden in Massachusetts. He lost a split decision. Vicky at this point begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. On March 5th, 1952, LaMotta drew with Gene Harrison at the Olympia in Detroit, the one place he used to batter everyone. He was now drinking, overeating, and according to Vicky, womanizing. Then they moved to Florida to make a fresh start, and LaMotta found his form in the ring and straightened himself out as well.
He signed on to meet Murphy, Hairston and Hayes in that order from April to June 1952 and was able to defeat all 3 of them by 10-round decisions. However, outside the ring, he began to cheat on Vicky and beat her. Once, after he beat her, she asked why he had done it, and she recalled, "He said, 'I did it because I loved you. I thought it would frighten you into coming back to me. Besides, I get hurt all the time. It doesn't mean anything.' Yet still, she stayed with him. She said for the kids. They had 3 children together, 1 daughter and 2 sons. On December the 31st, 1952, took on Danny Nardico in Florida, and if he could get past him, he could gain another title opportunity in his new division. It was reported to have been the first professional boxing match fought in Florida that was televised to a national audience. LaMotta was locked down for the first and only time in his career in the 7th round. After LaMotta got up, Nardico beat him against a corner until the bell rang, but his corner stopped the fight between the 7th and 8th rounds. Later, Jake did admit, "Old stupid got his block knocked off." Now, after over a year out of the ring, Jake returned and stopped a couple of bodies, but when he lost to Billy Kilgore on April 14, 1954, by split decision, Jake, after 106 fights, knew that it was time to quit. He had earned something approaching the $1 million mark in the ring, but had spent or squandered almost all of it, and his marriage was at rock bottom. In 1954, Jake La Motta retired from boxing with a record of 83 wins, 30 by knockout, 19 defeats and 4 draws.
So boxing career over, and Vicky, well, she had enough of Jake, and by 1956, and after 11 years of marriage, she actually filed for a separation. He had remained controlling and drank excessively at this point. And he was out at his nightclub until all hours, and he even came home with lipstick on his clothing. So one night, she went out for dinner with friends and walked in, and at Jake's bar, which was called Jake's in Miami Beach, he was with another woman. And Vicky said, I turned and walked out. He followed me, caught up with me at the car, and slugged me one, hard. The next thing, I knew I was on the ground, dazed and blood flowing from my ear, and a crowd of people gathered around me. I got up in a daze. Jake promptly drove her to the hospital to obtain stitches in her rear and made it out as if he had rescued her from some sort of accident. Vicky eventually left Jake, but he hounded her and wouldn't accept that she would ever leave him. Then he lost control, and this is what Vicky recalled in one of those another harrowing ordeal. He slugged me and punched me again. In the past, he had held something back when he hit me. This time, every punch was calculated to disable and cause pain, and the punches kept coming. Years later, she said the mere thought of the incident made her cringe. She said, I still cry when I talk about it because I didn't think anyone was capable of hurting me that badly. There was nothing I could do. I was helpless. The punches kept raining down. The fear set in. I thought Jake might actually kill me. Vicky's nose was broken and her entire chest area was left broken and blue. It didn't stop there. Jake was consistently physically abusive to Vicky. She tried to actually get a restraint order against him to no avail, and the police did nothing.
Vicky actually wrote her own autobiography, but it didn't get released until she'd actually passed away, quite simply because she was still scared of him. 20 years after penning her life story, she revealed all the brutal secrets from their marriage. When her book, Knockout, was published, she was not available to expand, discuss or explain it further. She laid bare her descriptions. Perhaps this was her way of getting revenge, either true to the core or exaggerated. It's up to you what you want to believe, but I think from the whole story that we've covered, I think we kind of get the feeling we know who we would believe. Jake himself, well, he admitted it loads of times, and here's another quote. When I was in the boxing business, I was one character. When I went home to my kids, I was a different character. After my career was over, I still had two characters. Before, I used to take it out on my opponents. Then I started taking it out on my wives. When Vicky finally divorced Jake in 1957, he continued on to do his evenings at his club. But then in 1958, he was eventually arrested and charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor and promoting sex work. According to Boxing News, authorities said La Motta introduced several adult men to an underage girl who was a sex worker at his nightclub. Jake La Motta was ultimately convicted and sentenced to serve 6 months on a chain gang. Lou Friedman wrote, the charge was brought by a 14-year-old girl who could have passed for 21. She made the complaint against La Motta. Yes, he probably did introduce her to men. The way La Motta operated and schmoozed at his club, he probably introduced 100 women to men. Did he knowingly promote prostitution? Likely not. There was no indication La Motta patronised prostitutes. He claimed women threw themselves at him, not because he was the handsomest dude in the building, but because of his fame, his boxing history, and being the main man in the club.
Yeah, he certainly had plenty of women after Vicky and probably while he was with Vicky. And Jake La Motta said in his defence that if that law, as in holding an owner liable, was really enforced, every other saloon keeper in Miami Beach would be spending his life in jail. Of his club, he said, there was good entertainment, pleasant surroundings, quiet atmosphere. I don't deny that guys could meet dolls there, just as they could anywhere else in the beach. Single guys and single gals often came into my joint, just as they did everywhere else. And if they wanted to talk to each other, what was I supposed to do? Tell them to get out? Well, Boxing News also reported that La Motta faced financial difficulty following his release from the chain gang. Prior to his arrest, he relied on the legacy of his boxing career to secure speaking engagements and bit parts in movies. However, following news of his arrest and conviction, the money-making opportunities essentially vanished. La Motta said he stayed away from home one Christmas as he was ashamed that he could not afford a Christmas tree or any gifts for his family. In 1960, 6 years after he had quit boxing, Jake La Motta came clean about that fixed fight against Billy Fox. He was called to testify before a US Senate subcommittee that was looking into the underworld influence on boxing. When Senator Estes Kiefer conducted a Senate investigation into boxing, enough people remembered the La Motta Fox fight to put this high on the list of bouts to be looked into. By this time, the Bronx Bull had retired and was working as a nightclub comic and a small part-time actor. He readily admitted that he had thrown the bout to Fox in order to secure a tilt at the world title. He explained about his poor physical condition before the fight and told the investigating committee, "When I realised I couldn't possibly win, I said I would lose to Billy Fox if I was guaranteed a championship fight."
He confessed that he had thrown his fight against Fox and he remarked, "Dan Parker, the Mirror guy, said the next day that my performance was so bad he was surprised the actor's equity didn't picket the joint." Jake has been branded a celebrity for his match-fixing exploits and managed to sustain his legend. If he had confessed when he was first accused of the fix, he would have been banished and forgotten, but for all his harrowing exploits outside the ring, the boxing world would have lost out on some unforgettable nights. Long into retirement, he told a sports writer, "The truth of the matter? The punches never hurt me. My nose was broken 6 times, my hands 6 times, a few fractured ribs, 50 stitches over my eyes, but the only place I got hurt was out of the ring." 10 years after the Senate hearing, Jake released Raging Bull, My Story, in a 1972 edition of his memoirs. His autobiography was then adapted into the 1980 Martin Scorsese film Raging Bull. It went on to be nominated for 8 Academy Awards, with Robert De Niro winning Best Actor for his portrayal of LaMotta. Now, as we have already mentioned, he went on to marry another 5 women, with 7 wives in total. Jake La Motta had 4 daughters, including Christy by his 2nd wife Vicky and Stephanie by his 4th wife Demetria. He married his 7th wife, longtime fiancée Denise Baker, on January the 4th, 2013. Now, in February 1998, Jake's elder son, Jake La Motta Jr., actually died of liver cancer. In September 1998, his younger son, Joseph La Motta, died in the crash of Swiss Air Flight 111. Jake remained active on the speaking and autograph circuit and published several books about his career, his life and his fights with Robinson. He appeared in a 50-minute New York stage production called Lady and the Champ in July 2012.
The production actually focused on La Motta's boxing career and was criticised by the New York Times as poorly executed and a bizarre debacle. La Motta is the subject of a documentary directed and produced by Greg Oliver. The film features an appearance by Mike Tyson, among other notable athletes, actors, and Jake's family and friends. Also in production was a sequel to Raging Bull, although MGM filed a suit to halt the project, saying that La Motta did not have the right to make a sequel for his own film. The lawsuit then was settled on July 31st, 2012, when La Motta agreed to change the title of the film to The Bronx Bull. Jake La Motta died on September the 19th, 2017, at the age of 95. His family confirmed the former boxer died of pneumonia at the Palm Garden of Adventura Nursing Home in Florida, where he was receiving hospice care. So just to the accolades, he was ranked 52nd on the Ring magazine's list of 80 best fighters of the last 80 years, and also ranked amongst its list as the 10 greatest middleweights of all time. La Motta was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in its first class in 1990. I'm going to leave you some quotes. So, after Jake had quit boxing, he could say what he wanted. And the one thing he did say was, the way we were brought up and the place we were brought up, staying out of the mob wasn't the easiest thing in the world. And I don't blame him, absolutely. And we're going to leave you with his most famous quote of all I thought Sugar Ray Robinson so many times. It's a wonder I don't have diabetes.
One hell of a story, Jake La Motta, and I think we've learnt a lot from this story and his career profile. And some of the things that I think we've learned in the research and putting this episode together are actually quite shocking and harrowing for me, not really knowing this stuff going into the episode, Johnston. And you guys listening to this, unless you are hardcore boxing fans and you've done your own homework on Jake La Motta, I bet there's a lot of yous that probably don't know half of this stuff. And it's the stuff that I'm referring to, as in the rape allegation that was obviously never fully substantiated, or he was never charged for it. There's, obviously it's something we're never going to truly know an answer to, but it is a piece of information that we felt that had to be included from one of the source materials that we put together for this episode. The fact that he was a womanizer, a woman beater, it's quite shocking really to hear all this stuff, because, whilst I consider us to be somewhat of historians, like, what we tend to do for this episode and these episodes that we cover is we try to go into it with being as open-minded as possible, and we put the research together for them and we put the story together for them, and then in doing that you start to realise that there's some stories out there that have been published in different source materials that actually there's some really shocking things there, there's some really shocking allegations, and I think that's kind of left a little bit of an impact on me as a fan of La Motta, and knowing all about the stuff that we'd previously done in our darker side of boxing and the mafia, and what we'd done in the tale of Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake La Motta, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and just knowing about him in general. The sort of stuff that we've covered in here isn't the sort of stuff that would always be widely publicised. A lot of what's publicised is a lot of what he did in his boxing career regarding Sugar Ray Robinson and regarding the fixed fight and the world title, but there's not a lot of stuff that gets widely published about allegations of rape, domestic abuse, domestic violence, and that's the sort of stuff that really hits home with me personally. So this episode is really, it's left a little bit of an impact on me in my perception of what I thought about Jake La Motta before. It's certainly changed now we've done it.
And I agree with you. I mean, the fact is that you can find all the sources and you can read the book yourself. He admits to the rape. So it's unbelievable that he was never, ever arrested for it. I mean, he does change his story compared to what Vicky says in terms of the abuse. The thing is with that is I haven't read Vicky's book, so a lot of the information came from Lou Friedman, where he used both the Raging Bull book and also Vicky's book, and he tried to use both. So do go and read his book, because it's a great source between the two, and it's inspired me to want to go and read Vicky's book, because she had a really tough upbringing as well with her dad as well. He used to beat her. And I will literally pick up that book and read that. And the fact that she wrote her own descriptions of her relationship with Jake, and she held back. I think it was with Thomas Hauser she wrote it with as well. And she waited 20 years, Sean, I mean, 20 years, because she was too scared to release that book while she was still alive. Literally, almost as soon as she died, she released it. And a lot of the stuff in there that came out turned people away from Jake. He would make jokes about beating his wives and they'd hold back, but she didn't hold back. And he treated her like a piece of shit. He treated her like a dog, an animal. And he admits to rape. I mean, it's hard because in those days, men beat their wives. I mean, I'm not saying every man did, but I'm telling you now, they drunkenly beat their wives. It was a thing. You could slap your wife about indoors and no one would bat an eyelid, even if they heard the beats from next door. Even up until the 80s, when I was a child, it was accepted. It's only today it seems ridiculous, absurd to even think that a man could raise his hands, let alone a boxer. And the description there where he literally almost beats her to death. He almost murders his first wife, Sean, and he's there debating whether to chuck her in the flipping Hudson or whatever river was close to him at the time. I mean, look, he had a traumatic life, but he was never able to curb it. He had a psychotic side to him. He was box. He was a psychopath. Let's face it. If he wasn't a boxer, he would have been done for murder. And he thought he had murdered someone. He thought he had murdered that Harry guy for years. And he only openly admitted that in his book because he realised he was still alive. So look, I've lost a lot of respect for him. I mean, it was difficult when we were doing these, Sean, because you get to the point of the rape, and then I sort of find myself training through the internet, just trying to, is this allegation? And it's like, no, it's not. And it sickens you. It really sickens you to the core. Again, I'm not condoning domestic violence and beating your wives, but it was a thing. You know, men were very fucking bright back then, and they used to be stupid. And so I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying that necessarily didn't turn me off completely off LaMotta, because I already knew from watching Raging Bull, which is a great film. But the rape is just, I can't deal with it, mate. I can't even look at him anymore, to be honest with you. The thought, if anything, it makes me want to go and watch the same Valentine's Massacre and watch Sugar Ray Robinson beat his ass to bits, to be honest with you, to get some satisfaction from having to do some of this and describe this detail. So if anyone found it offensive, you know, we apologise. It's a boxer, and you do find yourself talking about the domestic violence, the rape, the murder, or attempted murders. Hey, look, it's not the dark side of boxing. It was to celebrate. It's always to try and celebrate a career, Sean. Unfortunately, it's gone a twisted angle in it, and it's probably turned us off from Jake La Motta altogether.
People have got their own interpretations of the story, and you guys listening, I'm sure you will definitely have some food for thought now after listening to the episode, and you can go and do your own research and see that what we have put together is out there. You've just got to go and find it, and you can read it, and you can see this stuff for yourself. It's not us just making things up for the purpose of making the episode more sensationalized. We want to present you with facts.
Yeah, we don't want a bad mouth. We don't want to. I mean, I'm hoping if someone can find some information and says, you know what, that's a load of old.
Well, we'll have to wait and see whether the back of this episode actually brings any more information to light. I mean, I don't think there is. I mean, everything that he did when he was alive, you know, documentaries, books, everything's out there. There's nothing more really to do on Jake La Motta. So it's a case of now, do you look at him in a different way after listening to the episode? Well, I think you'd be not very human to not think a different way about him. I think I'd be very surprised if many people turn around and said, actually, you know what, I still love him for who he was. It's the same as like a Carlos Monzon, for example. People still celebrate Carlos Monzon, you know, as the greatest middleweight of all time. And then they just gloss over the fact that he literally went to prison for murder. So, you know, it's okay to celebrate a boxer and what they were in their careers. And the same with Edwin Valero and many others that we've covered that have committed heinous atrocities. But it is difficult to gloss over some of these facts once you know them. And once you know the stories inside out, it becomes more difficult to gloss over that information and try to celebrate that boxer's career. It really is difficult. And I think this is one thing that, you know, after doing this episode, if we ever do anything more on LaMotta, I'll always have this in the forefront of my mind now. It won't go away. And that's the thing about doing these episodes and doing the research and putting them together in such a way where you get to learn so much about things. And I'm sure you guys listening will feel the same. If you don't feel the same, I'd be very surprised. And
yeah,
take that
I wanted to interrupt you, Sean, because I just wanted to say one last bit on that, and it's just the fact is that rape subject that came up, you know, Viola, the young girl that he raped. I mean, you can find out a bit more about. I did find out a bit more about it, and I didn't really want to put it in because her life fell apart completely after that as well. You know, like any young girl would. And this didn't come out from her. This didn't come out from hearsay. This come out from the horse's mouth, Jake La Motta. You know, no one knew about it. He put it out there. So whether he was trying to, like, just getting all of his demons out on a bit of paper and releasing a book, and that was a way of him releasing all of that tension and all, because he clearly had problems. Clearly, you know, there's no doubt about it, psychotic problem, and maybe it was his way of sort of showing his remorse. I don't know, but it come from him. I think that's the problem. It's not like he can turn around. I mean, he's dead, but he can't turn around and say that this isn't true. And the other thing, when he sat there at the premiere of Raging Bull with him and Vicky, and the other bit of information we were going to put in here, but he sat there with Vicky, and she said to him, he said to her, Jesus, I wasn't that bad, was I? And she was like, you was worse. So, and even Raging Bull's quite bad. They show that as well. So that you take Raging Bull and look at Jake La Motta and then basically times that by 10, and I think you probably get the man of what he really was like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got to remember what we have covered in this career profile, which is the achievements he did go on. Of course, we've mentioned them. We've talked about him finally getting the world title, the fights with Sugar Ray Robinson, and that's what a lot of his legacy is based upon, is those two major factors. And we're glad to be able to have presented his life story in a career profile, and albeit some real negative stuff within it, but we feel like we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't include any of this information in there. And like I said earlier, if we glossed over these facts, we wouldn't be doing the job that we've always set out to do with these podcasts, which is to present full and factual stories and everything that's out there that you guys can go and read or look up or watch. And we can certainly all sit down and talk about these things and have these conversations, but ultimately when you do episodes like this, it certainly changes your perception of certain individuals in this sport. And it's certainly changed mine, and I know it's changed yours, Johnston. And I think for you guys listening, we hope that you have actually enjoyed the episode, albeit the problems and the issues that we've brought up with Jake La Motta. We hope you've actually enjoyed the story, and you've been able to learn a lot from it like we did doing the research for it. And of course, if you have, or if you've got any comments about any of the content of this episode, please, like you do, let us know on social media, on Twitter at career_profiles, or the BTR Boxing Podcast Network Facebook page, or the Instagram page, or even the TikTok page, any of those pages. I know a lot of you guys do watch the episodes, or should I say listen to the episodes on YouTube, and you do drop comments in the boxes below, so please continue to do that. We really genuinely appreciate it. A big shout out to Joe, who really enjoyed our Frank Bruno career profile and who told us how much it got him through a really difficult night. So big thanks to you, Joe, and I hope you're doing well. But to anybody else that this does the same thing for, please just drop us a comment and let us know, because we do genuinely like to see that it really does help other people. If you're listening to this through Spotify, you might have noticed that Spotify now produce an automatic comment section at the bottom, and it'll ask a question. What do you think of the episode? Please keep leaving your comments on there as well, because it is truly appreciated when we get to see the feedback about the episodes or any of your thoughts and feelings about the episode. So please continue to do that. Finally, I do want to take a moment to say thank you to all the patrons who sign up to us through patreon.com. Thank you to each one of you for supporting us on this journey. We really appreciate the additional support that you provide to us to allow us to go out there and purchase more literature and to put more information into these episodes and essentially leave no stone unturned in putting these episodes together. Thank you to each and every one of you. Now, if you're not a patron and you want to know more about what we do on patreon.com, please visit the site at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. On there, you could sign up to be a patron, and that would allow you to get ad-free versions of the episode, early access to the episodes when they're released. We have patron-only content, which is on there. We've got about 15, 16 one-off specials that have been commissioned previously, and then we've got our Boxing Through the Decades series as well. So please do go and check that out, and if you can support us in that way and get the additional things that we do offer, it is genuinely and truly appreciated. And that is it for this career profile. We do hope that you have enjoyed the life and the career profile of the Bronx Bull, Jake La Motta.